Section 1. The World That Never Changes. There is a house on Evergreen Terrace. It sits at the end of a quiet street in a town that could be anywhere in America. The paint is a faded yellow. The roof slopes gently on both sides. There's a mailbox out front, a car in the driveway, a dog sleeping on the porch, and inside, through the front window, you can just make out the blue flicker of a television set. The family inside is watching something, probably something loud, probably something funny, and through the walls you can hear faint laughter, the kind that comes easily, the kind that does not require explanation. You know this house. Even if you have never been there, you know it. You know the way the front door sticks slightly when it rains? You know the particular shade of the kitchen? You know the sound of the couch when someone settles into it for the long haul? And you know that somewhere in that living room, a man in a white shirt is probably eating something he should not be eating at this hour. You know all of it because this house, this family, this neighborhood has been there since 1989, 36 years. Through recessions and elections, through the rise of the internet and the collapse of video stores, and the invention of streaming, and the slow disappearance of the family sitcom as a format that anyone took seriously. Through all of it, the house on Evergreen Terrace stayed exactly the same. That is the first thing worth understanding about The Simpsons. Not the jokes, not the cultural satire, not the celebrity cameos or the elaborate storylines. The first thing worth understanding is the staying power. The show has outlasted almost everything around it. Competing networks have launched shows specifically designed to replicate its success and watch them fail within 2 seasons. Animated comedies have come and gone and been celebrated and forgotten. Television itself has transformed so dramatically that the broadcast network model the show was born into barely resembles what it is today. And still, every Sunday night, the couch gag plays and the family assembles and Homer sits down and the theme music begins and Springfield comes alive again. For most people who grew up watching the show, The Simpsons occupies a particular kind of emotional territory. It is neither entirely a children's show nor entirely an adult show. It is something in between, something that you watched as a kid because it was funny and colorful and Bart said things you were not supposed to say, and then you watched again as a teenager because the jokes worked on a different level, and then you watched again in your 20s or 30s and realized that the show had been telling you something serious all along. Something about family and work and money and the particular strain of American optimism that keeps people showing up to jobs they hate so they can afford houses in towns that are slowly poisoning them. You just had not been old enough to hear it. That is what this video is going to be about. Not theories, not mysteries, not the grand conspiratorial frameworks that explain every impossible thing that happens in Springfield, though we will touch on some of those along the way. This is about something quieter. This is about sitting with the show and understanding what it was actually doing, what it was actually saying, what the writers, across 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, were trying to build when they built Springfield. Because what they built is extraordinary, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. So settle in, get comfortable, let the familiar music play somewhere in the back of your mind. And let's start at the beginning, the very beginning, with the reason any of this matters in the first place. When Matt Groening first pitched the concept of The Simpsons to the Fox network in 1987, he did it in a hallway, essentially improvising a set of characters on the spot, because he had arrived unprepared to pitch his original comic strip characters and did not want to surrender the rights to them. He named the family after his own family. Homer was his father's name. Marge was a version of his mother's name. He gave them a son named Bart, an anagram of brat, and 2 daughters named Lisa and Maggie, borrowed from his sisters. He handed them a house in a town called Springfield, chose specifically because it was one of the most common city names in America, and because growing up near Springfield, Oregon, had left a particular impression on him. The pitch was accepted almost immediately. The network saw something in it, something about the shape of the family, the working-class father, the patient mother, the rebellious son. The overlooked daughters felt immediately familiar, felt like America, felt like the kind of household that had never really been given a cartoon of its own. The show premiered as a series of shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show in 1987 before becoming its own program in 1989. Those early shorts are rougher than the show most people know. The animation is slightly unsteady, the characters are proportioned differently, Homer's voice has a different quality to it. but the emotional architecture is already there. You can already see what the show is going to be. Homer is already trying. Marge is already watching him try. Bart is already pushing against something. Lisa is already waiting to be heard. And Maggie is already quiet, observant, taking everything in from a distance. What the show was building, from those first scratchy shorts through to the golden age of the early and mid-1990s and beyond, was not just a comedy, it was a portrait. A long, patient, detailed portrait of a specific kind of American life. The kind lived in the middle of the country, or in the suburban rings around mid-sized cities, or in towns big enough to have a mall and a nuclear power plant but not big enough to have anything you would travel to see. The kind of life defined by modest wages and modest houses, and the persistent, low-level anxiety of never quite having enough, while also never quite going without. The kind of life most people live, but few television shows have ever taken seriously as subject matter. The shows that existed before The Simpsons and occupied the same general territory the American family sitcom tended to resolve toward comfort. The conflicts were manageable. The fathers were wise or lovably bumbling in ways that never really threatened anyone. The mothers were patient, and the children were spirited, and the lessons were learned, and the half-hour always wrapped up neatly. The Cosby Show, Family Ties, Growing Pains, shows that dominated the 1980s were fundamentally optimistic about the American family. They presented the family as a place where love reliably triumphed over difficulty, where the messiness of life could be sorted out in 22 minutes, and where the overall feeling was one of warmth and reassurance. The Simpsons was built from a different blueprint entirely. It was not a show that believed problems got solved by the end of the episode. It was a show that believed problems accumulated, that the same fights happened over and over, that the same failures repeated themselves in slightly different forms, and that the love underneath all the chaos was real, precisely because it persisted despite the chaos rather than resolving it. Homer was not a bumbling father who learned his lesson by the final act. Homer was a man who made the same mistakes with tremendous consistency and was loved anyway. That is a fundamentally different thing, and it is a much more honest thing. And it is the thing that made the show resonate with people in a way that other family comedies never quite managed. To understand what The Simpsons was actually about, you have to understand what it was not afraid of. It was not afraid of depicting a father who was genuinely limited in ways that mattered. Not limited in the charming, cosmetic way that sitcom fathers are limited for getting anniversaries, botching DIY projects, but limited in ways that had real consequences. Homer Simpson made choices that hurt his family. He was selfish in ways that caused genuine damage. He failed to show up for his children in moments that mattered. He took Marge for granted in ways that, on any other show, would have constituted the slow erosion of a marriage. The show held all of this without flinching, and then it showed you something else. It showed you that he tried, that underneath the failures and the limitations, there was a man who loved his family so fiercely and so completely that it kept redefining what the word love was capable of containing. That tension between failure and love, between limitation and effort, between the person you are and the person you want to be, is the emotional core of The Simpsons. Everything else grows from it. Springfield itself was designed to be a container for all of that. Groening and the early writers built a town that could hold any kind of story, any kind of character, any kind of American type. The nuclear power plant could carry metaphors about environmental destruction and corporate corruption. The school could carry everything about how institutions fail children while insisting they are serving them. The church could hold the full complexity of American faith, the genuine comfort it offered alongside the ways it was used to suppress and control. The bar could be a place of community and waste simultaneously. The police department could be both a joke about institutional incompetence and a genuine source of anxiety for the people it was supposed to protect. Every building in Springfield was a thesis statement. Every institution was simultaneously what it claimed to be and something darker underneath. This is the thing that rewards sustained attention to the show. The comedy sits on top of something that is not comedy at all. The jokes are real jokes, genuinely funny, crafted with extraordinary care by a writer's room that was, especially during the golden years of the early 1990s, one of the most talented collections of writers ever assembled in American television. But beneath the jokes, running through everything, is a kind of serious engagement with American life that the show never entirely abandoned. Even in its later, more chaotic seasons, even when the plotting became looser and the emotional logic less rigorous, the show was still doing something, still asking something, still turning the same questions over and examining them from new angles. What is a family? What do we owe each other? What does it mean to live in a town that is slowly failing you? What does it mean to hold a job that diminishes you? What does it mean to love someone whose limitations cause you genuine suffering? What does it mean to be a child in a world that is not particularly interested in children? What does it mean to be smart in a place that does not reward intelligence? What does it mean to be good in a system that does not acknowledge goodness? Those are the questions. They have been the questions since the very first episode, and they will still be the questions in the very last one, whenever that comes. Everything that made The Simpsons what it is, the character work, the satirical targets, the emotional precision, the willingness to go dark when the story required it was in service of those questions. And the house on Evergreen Terrace is where those questions lived. The particular, specific, beloved house with the faded yellow paint and the car in the driveway and the television flickering blue through the front window. The house that never changed. The house you could always come back to, no matter how much time had passed, and find everything exactly where you left it. That is not just a production convenience. That is not just the practical reality of an animated show that cannot age its characters without eventually having to end itself. That is a choice. A deliberate, meaningful choice about what the show was for and what it was doing in the world. The Simpsons exists in permanent present tense. The family is always the age they were in 1989. The house is always the same house. The town is always the same town. Time passes in the world outside but not inside Springfield, and the show has been consistent about this for 36 years in a way that has very little precedent in television history. This refusal to age is, on one level, practical. You cannot run a show for 36 years and have your characters age in real time without eventually reaching a point where Bart is 47 and working at the plant alongside his father, and the entire emotional structure of the show has collapsed under the weight of its own timeline. Aging would mean ending, and ending was never part of the deal. The show was built to last. It was built to continue, and the floating timeline was the mechanism that made continuation possible. But there is something else in it. Something more interesting than practicality. The floating timeline is also a kind of promise. A promise to the audience that this family, this house, this town will always be here. That no matter what happens in the world outside Springfield, you can come back on Sunday night and find Homer still working at the plant, Bart still in 4th grade, Lisa still playing her saxophone, Marge still standing in that kitchen with the expression she always wears, the one that contains multitudes, the one that holds love and exhaustion and determination and a very quiet, very specific kind of sorrow all at the same time. The show understood something that most television does not. People do not watch long-running shows purely for novelty. They watch them for the feeling of return. For the experience of going back to a place you know, the laugh at the familiar joke, the warmth of the familiar face, the comfort of a world that behaves consistently, that does not surprise you with unwanted change, that holds the shape you know and love even as the rest of the world outside your window keeps rearranging itself into configurations you did not ask for and did not approve. The Simpsons has been that return for 36 years. And what makes it worth returning to is not just the comfort, though the comfort is real. What makes it worth returning to is the substance underneath the comfort, the seriousness underneath the jokes, the questions underneath the laughter, the portrait underneath the cartoon. That is what we are going to spend some time with tonight. Not rushing, not pulling at threads until things unravel, just sitting with it, understanding it, letting the show be what it was always trying to be. Take a breath, let your shoulders settle. The night is quiet outside and there is nowhere you need to be. This is Springfield. This has always been Springfield, and we are just getting started. If you are watching this late at night, drop a comment with your time and your city. There is something wonderful about knowing how many people are settling in from different corners of the world at the same quiet hour. And if this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, subscribing means you will never miss one. Section 2. The Nuclear Heart of Springfield. There is something you notice, once you start paying attention to the geography of Springfield, that you might have filed away as background detail without ever fully registering. No matter where the story takes you in any given episode, the school, the church, the bar, the town hall, the hospital, the mall, the cooling towers are always visible somewhere on the horizon. Sometimes they are far away, looming at the edge of the frame like a distant mountain range. Sometimes they are close enough that you can see the steam rising off them in lazy, curling columns. But they are always there, anchoring the frame, marking the skyline, reminding you, in that quiet visual way that good storytelling uses to communicate things the dialogue never says directly, that this town is organized around a specific center of gravity. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not a background element. It is the spine of the show. Everything in Springfield bends toward it or away from it, and the lives of the main characters are threaded through it so completely that understanding what the plant actually represents is essential to understanding what the show was actually doing. Let's start with what the plant is, on its most surface level. It is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It provides electrical power to the entire town of Springfield. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, a man so old and so wealthy that he functions less like a character and more like a force of nature, something that has always existed, that preceded the town and will outlast it, that shapes everything around it without ever fully belonging to the world it inhabits. Homer Simpson is, by job title, a safety inspector at this facility. His specific station is Sector 7G. His specific duties are, theoretically, to monitor the reactor systems, to catch anomalies before they become incidents, and to be the human firewall between the nuclear material inside those cooling towers and the residential neighborhoods within the blast radius. In practice, he sleeps at his workstation. He eats donuts during system warnings. He has caused a meaningful number of nuclear near misses through simple inattention. He is, by any objective measure, the least qualified person in America for the job he holds. And the show has always been clear about this. It is part of Homer's character, part of the texture of his life, part of the specific comedy that attaches to him. But there is a reason the show gave Homer this particular job. Not a random factory job, not a warehouse job, not a job at a grocery store or a construction site. A job at a nuclear power plant. And the reason is that nuclear power carries a specific set of meanings in American culture, meanings that were particularly charged in the late 1980s when the show was conceived, and that the writers were very deliberately working with. Nuclear power in 1989 carried the weight of 3 Mile Island, which had happened just a decade earlier. It carried the weight of Chernobyl, which had happened only 3 years before the show premiered. It carried the anxiety of an entire Cold War era, in which nuclear energy and nuclear weapons had become inextricably tangled in the public imagination. The same force that could power a city could also end the world, and the distinction between those two applications felt uncomfortably thin. The cooling towers on Springfield's skyline were not just a setting. They were a symbol, immediately legible to any American viewer of that era, of the bargain the country had struck with modernity, the trade of safety and sovereignty for cheap electricity and industrial power. Homer's job at that plant is the bargain made literal. He has given his health, his cognitive capacity, his autonomy, his sense of self, in exchange for a paycheck that allows him to own that house on Evergreen Terrace, to feed his family, to keep the lights on and the refrigerator stocked and the television running. The deal he has struck is exactly the deal that millions of working Americans had struck with exactly the industries that were slowly consuming them. The scale was smaller, the poison usually less literal, but the essential transaction was the same. You give us your best years. You give us your physical safety. You give us your attention and your obedience and your willingness to pretend that the conditions of your employment are acceptable. And we give you just enough to live on. The plant as an institution is interesting precisely because it is never presented as exceptional. It is not a villain's lair. It is not a place of obvious horror. It is just a workplace. A workplace that happens to have 342 safety violations, that happens to dump its waste into local waterways, that happens to be run by a man who has been alive since before the invention of the automobile. But structurally, functionally, it looks and operates like any other large American employer. There are shift supervisors and HR departments and mandatory safety trainings that everyone ignores. There are retirement parties in the break room and interdepartmental memos and the general atmosphere of mild organizational dysfunction that characterizes every large institution that has outlived whatever purpose originally justified its existence. The plant as workplace is where the show did some of its deepest thinking about labor, about what it means to spend a significant portion of your waking life in a place that does not particularly value you. About the specific psychological accommodations that working people make to survive jobs that are beneath their dignity, or beyond their enthusiasm, or simply wrong for them in some fundamental way. Homer is not bad at his job because he is lazy, exactly. Though laziness is certainly part of his character, Homer is bad at his job because his job is an affront to his humanity in a very specific sense. He was not made for this. No one was made for this. And the comedy of his spectacular incompetence is inseparable from the tragedy of a system that placed him there and left him there and defined his life in terms of his performance there. Burns, as the owner of the plant, is doing something more sophisticated than simply being a villain. He is representing a specific theory of power, a theory that the show examines with great care and considerable sophistication across its run. Burns's theory, reduced to its essence, is that wealth is the only real currency of human experience, that loyalty can be manufactured through dependency, that the most effective way to control a population is to make that population unable to imagine its own survival without you. He does not keep Springfield poor through malice alone. He keeps Springfield poor through architecture. By owning the power plant, he owns the town's electrical infrastructure. By owning the electrical infrastructure, he owns the economic conditions under which the town operates. By owning those conditions, he owns the political landscape, because politicians in a town with one major employer are not free agents. They are employees with a different job title. This is not a cartoon theory of power. This is a description of how power actually works in small industrial towns across America and has worked for the better part of the 20th century. Company towns, where a single employer owned the housing, the grocery stores, the utilities, and the local government, were a real and specific feature of American economic life for decades. The coal company towns of Appalachia, the mill towns of New England, the textile manufacturing communities of the South. Springfield, with its single dominant employer and its captured political class and its population that seems constitutionally incapable of organizing any meaningful resistance to the conditions of its own exploitation, is a portrait of that phenomenon drawn with exaggeration for comic effect, but rooted in something very real. Burns's relationship with Homer is the relationship between this system and its workers, made intimate. Burns cannot remember Homer's name. This is one of the show's running gags, the kind that accumulates meaning through repetition. Homer has worked at the plant for years. He has interacted with Burns in dozens of contexts, some of them quite intense, some of them involving Homer literally saving Burns's life or the plant's operation. And still, reliably, Burns looks at him and draws a blank, cannot place the face, cannot retrieve the name. Occasionally gets close, gets Homer's neighbor or a vague physical description, but never quite arrives at the name of the man who has given him 30-plus years of labor. This is not just a joke about Burns's age or his eccentricity. It is a statement about what workers are, within the logic of the system that employs them. They are interchangeable. Their individuality, their names, their histories, their families, the entire texture of their human lives is irrelevant to the function they serve. Burns does not need to know Homer's name because Homer's name is not a variable that affects the plant's output. Homer's name matters to Marge and to Bart and to Lisa and to Maggie. It does not matter to the institution. And the institution's inability to register Homer as a named individual, rather than an undifferentiated unit of labor, is the show's clearest statement about what industrial capitalism does to the people who operate within it. Homer's response to this, his genuine hurt, his periodic desperation to be recognized, to have Burns say his name and mean it, is played for both comedy and pathos simultaneously. It is funny because the gap between Homer's expectations and reality is so large, but it is also quietly devastating because what Homer wants is so simple. He just wants to matter. He just wants to be a person to the man who employs him. He wants the relationship to have some small quality of human recognition, some acknowledgement that the 30 years of his life he has spent in Sector 7G were noticed by someone, that he was not invisible. that his presence left some trace. Burns will never give him that. Not because Burns is particularly cruel, though he can be, but because the system Burns operates does not have a mechanism for it. The plant runs on interchangeability. The moment you start treating workers as individuals with names and histories and needs, you open a door that is very difficult to close, because individuals have claims. Individuals can argue that their specific circumstances deserve specific consideration. Individuals can appeal to the relationship. Interchangeable units cannot do any of that. The environmental dimension of the plant's operation adds another layer entirely. The show establishes, through years of accumulated detail, that the plant is doing something to Springfield's ecosystem. The three-eyed fish, Blinky, pulled from a river near the plant. The luminous rats in the facility's maintenance tunnels. The odd coloration and physical characteristics of Springfield's residents, which we will talk about more as this video continues. The show drops these details casually, treats them as color, moves past them without comment, but the accumulation of them, over 36 seasons, creates a picture that is difficult to look away from. The plant is poisoning the town. This is not stated directly, but it is shown repeatedly, and the show is careful enough about the distinction between what its characters notice and what the audience is allowed to observe, that this particular gap between the evidence available and the conclusions drawn becomes itself a statement. Springfield cannot see what is happening to it. It cannot organize the evidence into a coherent picture. It lives downstream from the plant and drinks the water and trusts that the authorities would tell them if something was wrong, and this trust is exactly the trust that the system relies on to continue operating. The plant's safety inspection record is the comedy version of this. 342 violations. A figure so large it circles back around from horror to absurdity, which is exactly where the show lives most comfortably. The show is not trying to make you angry about nuclear safety. It is trying to make you laugh, and then, later, in the quiet after the laughter, it is hoping that you will sit with what you just laughed at and feel the weight of it. That is the show's mechanism. Comedy as delivery system for ideas that would be too heavy to carry on their own. The cost to bring the plant up to code, $56 million. Burns refuses to spend it. Not because he does not have the money. He is a billionaire many times over. He refuses because spending it would be an acknowledgement that the violations existed, and that acknowledgement would be a door, and doors lead to questions. Questions about how long the violations had been present. Questions about what the violations had already done. Questions about the water supply and the fish with 3 eyes, and the workers whose cognitive functions seem to be declining at a pace that casual observation could not explain. So Burns keeps Homer in Sector 7G, keeps the violations uncorrected, keeps the cooling towers cracked and the waste disposal unchecked, and the entire arrangement exactly as it has always been. Not because he is indifferent to the consequences. The show makes clear, across many episodes, that Burns understands radiation very well. He understands it in a personal, biological way, because his own survival depends on managing its effects. He has private physicians. He undergoes medical treatments of extraordinary intensity on a regular schedule. He is, in a very real sense, powered by the same force that powers his plant. He knows what it does. He knows what it has done to Springfield. He has simply decided that his continued accumulation of wealth is a higher priority than the health of the population that serves him. This is not a caricature of villainy. It is a description of a real economic calculation. The calculation that says the cost of compliance, the cost of safety, the cost of taking care of the people whose labor creates your wealth is higher than the cost of ignoring all of those things. That as long as the damage is distributed across a population and across time, rather than concentrated in a single visible incident, the political will to force accountability will never fully materialize. That the people most harmed are also the people least positioned to organize resistance. Burns embodies this calculation. He is its avatar, and the plant is the monument to it, those cooling towers on the Springfield skyline, visible from every part of town, generating the electricity that runs the televisions on which the residents watch their own distraction. There is something very particular about the relationship between the plant and the town's sense of identity. Springfield would not exist without the plant. The jobs, the tax base, the economic activity generated by the plant's presence, all of it is bound up with the plant's continued operation. Burns has engineered a situation in which attacking him is indistinguishable from attacking your own livelihood. When characters in the show try to challenge Burns when a gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky the three-eyed fish as evidence of environmental destruction, for instance, the challenge tends to collapse not because Burns is powerful enough to simply crush it, though he is, but because the challenge requires the town to accept a version of reality that the town cannot afford to accept. If Burns is polluting Springfield, then Springfield is being poisoned. If Springfield is being poisoned, then the lives they have been living are built on a foundation of damage. If their lives are built on damage, then what does that mean for the children? For the water they drank growing up? For the air they breathed? It is easier to eat the fish on live television and declare it harmless. It is easier to look at the steam rising from the cooling towers and think of it as just weather. It is easier to live in the town that employs you than to acknowledge what the town is doing to you. This is the nuclear heart of Springfield. Not just the physical plant with its cracked towers and its 342 violations and its safety inspector asleep in Sector 7G. The nuclear heart is the arrangement, the binding of an entire community's economic survival to a single entity that does not care about that community, the gradual erosion of the conditions of life in exchange for the conditions of employment, the slow, patient, nearly invisible poisoning of everything downstream. The show made Homer work at the plant because the plant was the most honest symbol available for what his life was, what a lot of people's lives were. A deal struck in youth, when you needed the money and the options looked limited, that you kept honoring long after the terms stopped making sense. A deal with something that was never going to remember your name. Homer never leaves the plant. In 36 seasons, he has worked hundreds of other jobs, held dozens of other titles, lived several entirely different lives in different episodes, but he always comes back to Sector 7G. The plant is always home. And the question the show has never stopped asking, in the quiet underneath the comedy, is what that means. What it means to call a place that is slowly consuming you home. What it means to love the thing that diminishes you. What it means to stay. We will spend the rest of tonight trying to understand that question through the people it shaped. Because the plant is the context, but the family is the story. And the family is where everything the show was actually about becomes real. Section 3. Homer and the weight he was never meant to carry. Homer Simpson is one of the most analyzed fictional characters in the history of American television. And the reason for that is simple. He is extraordinarily complicated while appearing to be extraordinarily simple. He presents to the world as a man of enormous appetites and minimal reflection, someone driven by immediate desire, easily distracted, reliably inconsiderate of consequences, spectacularly bad at most of the things a functional adult is expected to be good at. He eats too much, he drinks too much, he sleeps through things that matter. He forgets anniversaries. He does not always listen. He has, at various points in the show's history, been described as having the IQ of a man with a crayon lodged in his brain, which is both a joke and, canonically within the show's universe, an accurate description of his neurological situation. And yet, Homer Simpson may be the most emotionally complex character the American sitcom has ever produced. He is certainly the most honest. The show did something with him that very few shows have ever managed with a main character. It refused to let him off the hook while also refusing to abandon him. It held him accountable for his failures, depicted the real damage those failures caused, and then showed you with absolute consistency, across 36 years of storytelling, that his love for his family was not conditional, and was not performance, and was not reducible to any of his other qualities. It was simply there, the most real thing about him, the only thing that never wavered. To understand Homer fully, you have to understand where he came from. Not just the biographical facts of his childhood, his mother's absence, his father's emotional distance, the particular loneliness of growing up believing you were unloved, but the emotional architecture those facts built. Homer Simpson is a man who spent his formative years operating on the assumption that something was fundamentally wrong with him, that his mother had left because he was not worth staying for, that his father could not reach him because he was somehow unreachable, that the warmth he needed was simply not available. Not for him, and that this unavailability was a statement about his value rather than a statement about the failures of the adults around him. This is not subtext in the show. It is text. The show returns to Homer's childhood repeatedly, each time adding detail, each time filling in more of the picture, and the picture it paints is of a child who absorbed a wound very early and spent the rest of his life organizing himself around it. His desperate need to be liked, his inability to tolerate being ignored, his tendency to seek approval from every authority figure he encounters, including the employer who cannot remember his name, his profound, almost bottomless gratitude for any act of warmth directed at him, the way he responds to Marge's love as if it is a miracle he still cannot quite believe in, even after decades of marriage. His mother, Mona Simpson, was not dead. She had been alive the whole time, living underground, a fugitive from charges stemming from an act of political activism in the late 1960s. The man whose biological weapons laboratory she had helped destroy, the man who had reported her to the FBI and pursued her for decades afterward, was Charles Montgomery Burns. Homer's mother was driven out of his life by his own employer. He grew up defined by a loss that was engineered by the man who would sign his paychecks for 30-plus years. He spent his entire adult life working for the man who broke his family when he was 6 years old, and he never fully made the connection. His brain damaged by radiation, limited by the crayon, worn down by years of conditions designed to produce exactly this kind of cognitive blunting, could not hold the architecture of his own suffering, clearly enough to see what it was built from. The crayon in the brain episode, when Homer has the foreign object removed and briefly attains something like his full intellectual potential, is one of the show's most quietly devastating experiments. The viewer watches Homer become articulate and perceptive, and genuinely funny in a different way, sharper, more self-aware, more capable of seeing the world clearly. And what he sees when he finally looks clearly is unbearable. He sees his job for what it is. He sees his town for what it is. He sees the architecture of his own limitation with sudden, terrible clarity. The intelligence does not make him happy. It makes him lonely in a way that his previous life, for all its frustrations and humiliations, had never quite managed. Because intelligence without community is a particular kind of suffering. And Springfield was not built for intelligence. Springfield was built for something else. He has the crayon put back. He chooses the fog. He chooses the warmth of not knowing over the clarity of knowing but being isolated by it. And this is the moment that the show asks you to make a judgment about Homer, and then refuses to tell you what judgment to make. Is this weakness? Is it wisdom? Is it both simultaneously? In the way that most real human decisions are both simultaneously? The show does not say. It shows you Homer choosing the life he has, the life he knows, the life that contains Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, and it lets you sit with the choice. There is a theory about Homer that the show does not state directly, but demonstrates with extraordinary care across hundreds of episodes. And it is this: Homer Simpson is not primarily a comedy character. He is a tragedy that the show tells you is a comedy so that you can bear to watch it. The laughs are real, the comedy is real, but the underlying story, a man whose potential was systematically limited by forces far more powerful than he was, who compensated for that limitation with love, who was good at only one thing and gave everything he had to that one thing even when he failed at it catastrophically, is not a comic story. It is the kind of story that requires the frame of comedy to be survivable. Homer's relationship with Bart contains one of the show's most sophisticated threads. The strangling gag Homer's hands going to Bart's neck as a reflexive response to Bart's provocations is the show's most polarizing running joke. Some viewers find it funny. Some find it uncomfortable. Some find it unfunny precisely because it is too close to something real. But what the show is doing with it across all of its iterations is tracing the line between frustration and love in a father-son relationship where neither party has very good tools for expressing either thing. Homer does not know how to tell Bart that he loves him, in a way Bart will hear and believe. Bart does not know how to ask for that from Homer, in a way Homer will understand. They speak to each other through conflict because conflict is the language they both learned. And underneath every conflict, every provocation, every instance of Homer's hands going to Bart's neck is the desperate mutual need of a father and son who love each other far more than they are able to say. The episodes that break this pattern, the episodes where Homer and Bart are simply kind to each other, where they reach each other without the mediation of conflict, are among the show's most emotionally powerful. Bart gets an F. Where Bart is facing the prospect of being held back, and Homer's response is not anger but genuine, clumsy, determined effort to help his son study, is 1. The episodes involving bowling or fishing or some other shared activity, where the comedy comes from their similarity rather than their conflict, The moment in Homer Loves Flanders where Homer has been so warmed by Ned's unconditional friendship that he responds with something like the emotional openness he usually keeps buried. These moments work because they are contrasts. They stand out against the background of Homer's usual behavior, and they work as evidence that the background is not all there is. That the man who sleeps through his daughter's school recital is the same man who would walk through fire for her without thinking twice. That the man who regularly humiliates himself, his family, and his employer is also the man who, at moments of genuine crisis, is capable of a love so fierce and so uncomplicated that it overrides everything else. Homer and Marge's marriage is where the show's most sustained emotional thinking happened. It is one of the longest-running depictions of a marriage in American television history, and it is also one of the most honest. The show never pretended that their love resolved the difficulties of their specific pairing. Homer and Marge are not obviously compatible people. She is patient and organized and emotionally perceptive, and deeply invested in doing things correctly. He is chaotic and impulsive, and emotionally blunt and invested primarily in doing things that feel good immediately. The ways their temperaments clash are real and recurring and do not get resolved. What happens instead is something more interesting. They have learned, over 36 years of fictional marriage, to hold the space where they differ without letting it be the space that defines them. Marge's love for Homer is the show's central mystery, and it is handled with remarkable intelligence. Because the obvious question, the one that the audience brings to the show from outside, is why? Why does she stay? Why does a woman of her intelligence, her emotional capacity, her fundamental goodness stay with a man who is so frequently a source of difficulty? The show has, at various points, explored this directly, Marge considering leaving, Marge fantasizing about different lives, Marge articulating the specific costs of her specific choice with unusual clarity. And what it always comes back to is not that Homer is secretly a perfect husband who has been misrepresented. He is not. What it comes back to is something simpler and more complex simultaneously. He is her person. The specific, particular, irreplaceable man who has been her person since she was a teenager, who she has chosen to build a life with, and whose love for her, loud and bumbling and frequently misdirected but absolutely total, is the one thing in her world that she never has to doubt. Homer's love for Marge is the one area in which he is competent without effort. He does not have to work at it. He does not have to remember to feel it. It is simply there, as reliable and as present as his own breathing. He is bad at expressing it in conventional ways. He forgets flowers and misses events and fails to use his words at the moments when words would help most. But Marge knows. She has always known, and the show trusts its audience to know it too, not because it is told to them in a speech, but because it accumulates across hundreds of episodes of Homer in his inconsistent and spectacular way, always coming back. Homer as father to Lisa is one of the show's richest veins. They are, in the most fundamental sense, incompatible. Lisa is everything Homer is not: disciplined, articulate, morally serious, intellectually ambitious, constitutionally unable to let injustice pass without comment. She operates from a set of values that Homer does not share and, if he is being honest with himself, does not always understand. And yet Homer's love for Lisa is one of the most straightforward and unconditional things the show depicts. He does not require Lisa to be different. He does not wish she were easier or more like him. He simply loves her. In the specific, particular way a father loves a daughter who has gone further than he has with pride that is inseparable from a small, inarticulate grief, the grief of watching someone you love become fully themselves, in a world that is not always kind to people who are fully themselves. The saxophone is the symbol the show uses for all of this. Homer does not understand jazz. He does not understand why Lisa practices as obsessively as she does, or what it means to her, or why it matters. But he buys her the saxophone. He defends it. He takes its importance on faith, because he trusts her to know what is true about herself even when he cannot see it. That is a form of love that is not common in comedy. It is not the love that says, "I understand you." It is the love that says, "I do not have to understand you to be entirely on your side." Homer's arc across the show's run is not a traditional arc. He does not grow. He does not improve in any sustained way. He fails the same tests repeatedly. He makes the same mistakes with remarkable fidelity. But the show argues, and I think convincingly, that this is not a failure of the character or of the writing. It is an honest depiction of something true about people. Most people do not change in dramatic ways. Most people do not have arcs, they have patterns. They have the particular constellation of strengths and failures that they arrive at in young adulthood, and they carry that constellation for the rest of their lives, and the question is not whether the pattern changes, but whether the love inside the pattern is real. Homer's love is real. It has been real for 36 years. It is the most real thing in Springfield. And that is why, despite everything, despite the plant and the radiation and the crayon and the mother he lost and the intelligence he never got to use, Homer Simpson is not a sad character at the core. He is, in some very fundamental way, a fortunate one. He found the thing worth having. He held on to it with both hands. And every episode, every reset, every return to the couch and the television and the family assembled around it, is an argument that the specific warmth of this specific imperfect family was always enough. That is what Homer was actually about. Not the comedy of his failures, the steadiness of his love. And the quiet, nearly invisible argument the show made for 36 years that the steadiness of love is a kind of heroism, the kind nobody writes songs about, the kind that does not make headlines, the kind that shows up imperfectly every day and tries. Section 4. Marge, the quiet architecture of the family. There is a version of Marge Simpson that the show does not want you to settle for, the version that is defined by her patience. That characterizes her primarily as the force that absorbs and smooths and repairs the damage generated by everyone around her. The version that sees her as the stable background against which the comedy of Homer and Bart plays out the straight line, the straight face, the grounding wire that keeps the whole household from shorting out. That version of Marge exists. There are episodes, especially in the later seasons, where she functions primarily as a structural device, the character whose concern and caution sets the plot in motion, whose disapproval establishes the moral stakes, whose eventual acceptance or forgiveness resolves whatever mess has been created. In those episodes, she is a function more than a person, a role more than a character. But that is not who Marge Simpson was in the show's most serious, most careful thinking about her. The real Marge is substantially more interesting and substantially more complicated than the patient mother the marketing imagery tends to reduce her to. And spending time with who she actually is, what the show actually did with her across its best seasons, reveals something the show understood about a certain kind of American woman that very few cultural products of its era were willing to engage with honestly. Marge Bouvier grew up in a middle-class family in Springfield. She was smart. The show establishes this repeatedly, though it tends to establish it quietly in ways that are easy to miss if you are not paying attention. She had ambitions that were both real and specific. She wanted to be a painter at one point. She wanted to be a police officer. She wanted to run a business. She had, in the parts of herself that she had not submerged into the role of wife and mother, a genuine person with genuine desires and genuine capabilities. The show is careful to establish all of this, and equally careful to show how much of it she had set aside, not because it was taken from her, but because she made a choice and then made another choice, and then made another choice, and each choice was freely made and also constrained by the logic of her specific circumstances in specific ways. The choice she made was Homer. She chose him in high school, in the face of her parents' disapproval, in the face of evidence that he was not the obvious choice, not the most academically promising, not the most financially stable prospect, not the one who seemed most likely to provide the kind of security that her cautious, conventional upbringing had trained her to want. She chose him because she loved him, because the specific quality of his love for her, total, transparent, not complicated by agenda, was something she had never encountered from anyone else and was not willing to walk away from. And then she married him and had children, and the domestic life took over, as domestic lives do, and the ambitions that had been hers specifically rather than hers as a function of a family role, those got smaller and quieter. Not gone, but quieter. The show returns to them repeatedly. Marge takes a painting class and discovers she has real talent. She joins the police force and is good at it. She starts a business and manages it with competence and imagination. In each of these episodes, she has access to a version of herself that the daily management of the household does not give her room to inhabit. And in each of these episodes, something happens, usually something involving Homer or the family's collective need that pulls her back, that redirects her attention and her energy toward the role she has assigned herself, rather than the self underneath the role. The show does not present this as tragedy, exactly. It does not moralize about what Marge gave up or condemn the circumstances that shaped her choices. It is more honest than that. It presents Marge's relationship to her own ambitions as genuinely complicated as something she herself is not entirely certain how to feel about, something she has not resolved and probably will not resolve, something she carries with her as part of the texture of her interior life, without it becoming a crisis. She loves her family. She chose this. She also, sometimes, when she is alone in the kitchen late at night or standing at the window watching the others sleep, feels the weight of everything she did not get to be. The show handles this weight without dramatizing it into catastrophe. Marge does not leave. She does not have a breakdown. She does not become bitter or withholding or destructive. She carries the weight in the particular, quiet, very female way that the show was perceptive enough to see, not through expression but through absorption. Not through acting out, but through continuing to manage, to smooth, to absorb the impact of a family that generates more chaos than it resolves. Her relationship with Homer is the central transaction of her life, and it is a transaction the show examines with unusual honesty about what it costs and what it gives. Homer takes. He takes energy, attention, emotional bandwidth, the patience that she offers endlessly, and that is not actually unlimited, even though she behaves as if it is. He forgets things that matter to her. He embarrasses her. He makes decisions without consulting her. He fills their house with projects that fail and friends that complicate and predicaments that need managing, and he gives love so uncomplicated and so total that it has never, in 36 years of marriage, required her to question it. He gives her a life that is genuinely eventful, in the way that his particular kind of disaster-generating personality ensures. He gives her the experience of being the most important person in the world, to someone who has absolutely no talent for hiding how he feels. When Homer looks at Marge, he looks at her the way very few people get to be looked at, like she is the organizing principle of his entire life. Like everything else is secondary, like she is the answer to a question he was asking before he knew he was asking it. This is not a small thing. The show knows it is not a small thing. And Marge knows it too, which is why the equation makes sense even when its costs are high. Marge's relationship with Bart is one of the show's most emotionally precise. She is the only person who loves Bart without reservation and without agenda. Homer's love for Bart is real but complicated by ego. Bart is Homer's son, his continuation, a mirror that reflects things Homer is not always comfortable seeing. Lisa's relationship with Bart is affectionate but marked by the specific friction of siblings who do not understand each other's fundamental drives. Marge simply loves him. The provocation, the rule-breaking, the deliberate incitement, none of it touches the quality of her love for him. She understands, in the way that some mothers understand, that Bart's behavior is not a statement about his character. It is a language. And in that language, if you are fluent, what Bart is saying most of the time is that he needs to be seen. Marge sees him, consistently, completely, without requiring him to be different first. This is the great gift of her motherhood, and the show depicts it with a gentleness that is among its best qualities. Bart, for all his surface bravado, for all the performance of invulnerability that he maintains in almost every other relationship, is entirely soft around Marge. The episodes that explore this tend to be the show's warmest, because they access something underneath the comedy that is just unguarded human feeling, a boy and his mother, the original uncomplicated love. With Lisa, the relationship is different and in some ways more complex. Marge loves Lisa without reservation, but Marge does not always know what to do with Lisa. Lisa is smarter than the family understands how to respond to, more morally serious than the household's operating mode can accommodate, and more likely to articulate clearly what is wrong with the world around her than anyone in Springfield, including her own mother, finds entirely comfortable. Marge's instinct with Lisa is to protect her, to try to shield her from the specific pain of being the kind of person she is in the specific place she is. This protection is genuine and loving, and also, sometimes, a form of the show's broader theme about how Springfield handles inconvenient truths. By trying to make Lisa more comfortable, Marge is occasionally participating in the same soft suppression of difficult reality that the town itself performs. She means well, she does it out of love, and the show is honest enough to show that it does not always help. Marge's role as the moral center of the family is something the show takes seriously without romanticizing. She is not infallible. She is not always right. She makes her own mistakes, overprotects, misjudges, occasionally imposes her own anxieties on the people she is trying to help. What she provides is not moral perfection, it is moral consistency. She has a sense of what is right that persists across contexts. She is not the character who finds reasons why the ends justify the means. She is not the character who shades her behavior to accommodate convenience. She is, in a show populated by characters who bend readily under various forms of pressure, the one who bends least. What the show was doing with Marge, at its most thoughtful, was examining the specific experience of a woman who had organized her life around other people's needs in ways that were both genuinely loving and also, on occasion, a way of not having to face her own needs fully. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about a particular pattern that the show recognized in the culture around it, a pattern that many women of Marge's generation and circumstances lived, and that it chose to depict with the same care and absence of easy judgment that it applied to Homer's failures. The Tower of Blue Hair is the show's visual statement about Marge. It is impossible, architecturally speaking. It should not be able to maintain that height and that shape without intervention, and it never changes. It has been exactly that height and that shape for 36 years. The show is saying something with this about Marge's particular quality of permanence, her refusal to shift or diminish, the way she holds her shape regardless of what the world is doing around her. But it is also saying something about the effort involved. The tower is not natural. It takes work to maintain. Something real goes into keeping it exactly as it is. And Marge makes that look effortless because the effort is the thing she does not show you. That is Marge Simpson, the quiet architecture of a family that would not stand without her, and the person underneath the architecture who the show, at its best, never let you forget was there. Section 5. Bart and the Boy America Needed. When The Simpsons premiered in 1989, Bart Simpson became an immediate cultural phenomenon in a way that the show's creators had not entirely anticipated. He was the character that children latched onto, that parents worried about, that teachers complained about, that school administrators sent stern letters home about, that merchandisers plastered on everything from t-shirts to skateboard decks to backpacks to pencil cases. Don't have a cow, man. Eat my shorts. Underachiever and proud of it. The catchphrases spread through playgrounds and hallways with the speed of something genuinely viral before the word viral meant what it means now. But here is the thing that the cultural panic about Bart Simpson missed entirely. Bart was not a bad influence. Bart was an honest depiction of something real about childhood that American popular culture had been systematically polishing away for decades. He was a boy who did not want to comply, who did not see the point of complying, who experienced the institutional apparatus of his education and upbringing as something fundamentally disconnected from anything he cared about and responded to that disconnection with the only tools available to him: disruption, humor, resistance, and the specific kind of creative mischief that is intelligence without an approved outlet. The concern about Bart was never really about Bart. The concern was about what Bart represented. The possibility that children might watch a 10-year-old who refuses to be good and take that refusal as permission for their own. But the show never presented Bart's refusal as costless or glamorous. It presented it honestly as something that isolated him, that caused him real difficulty, that generated genuine suffering alongside the comedy. Bart's pranks frequently backfired. His academic failures had real emotional weight behind the jokes. His relationships with authority figures were complicated in ways that were not simply fun. He lived with the specific loneliness of a kid who cannot fit into the structures designed to contain him and does not know what to replace them with. The character the show built in Bart over its run is considerably more layered than the pop culture image of him suggests. The surface, Bart, the skateboarder, the prankster, the disruptive force is real and is drawn with great affection. The show loves Bart's irreverence. It takes pleasure in his pranks, in the particular creativity of his disruptions, in the way he approaches every rule as a challenge to be navigated rather than a boundary to be respected. This is not presented as simply wrong. The show gives Bart's perspective real dignity. His suspicion of authority is not paranoia. He has reasons for it. The school system, as Springfield Elementary depicts it, is an institution that is failing Bart in very specific ways. Principal Skinner is a man whose authority is entirely positional, not earned, not organic, maintained through bureaucratic control rather than genuine respect. The teachers range from the genuinely caring but institutionally constrained. Miss Krabappel, who is more complicated than she, appears to the indifferent and the merely present. The curriculum is designed for students who are wired to receive it passively, who find meaning in the transmission of approved information, and Bart is not that student, and the system has no particular interest in reaching him where he actually is. Miss Krabappel deserves more time than the show often gives her, because she is one of the more tragic supporting characters in the series. She is a woman who chose a vocation and found herself trapped in an institution that had depleted her long before we meet her. The way she teaches Bart with the exhausted contempt of someone who long ago stopped believing the job could be different is not malice. It is the occupational damage of a person whose optimism about what the job could be was defeated by what the job actually was. Her relationship with Bart, beneath the surface antagonism, contains something that looks occasionally like the recognition of kindred spirits, two people who are both, in their different ways, trapped in a role that does not fit them. Bart's intelligence is one of the show's persistent themes, and it is depicted with care. He is not smart in the ways the school measures intelligence. He does not test well. He does not demonstrate knowledge in the formats the institution recognizes. But he is sharp in ways that the classroom cannot access, perceptive about people, quick with situations, creative under pressure, capable of improvisation that most adults would not manage. He is a kid who would have flourished in circumstances that gave him room to be who he actually is. The circumstances he has, Springfield Elementary in a town organized around a nuclear plant, do not provide that room. And so the intelligence that should be his greatest asset becomes, in the institutional context, his most consistent liability. The relationship between Bart and Homer is where the show does its deepest thinking about how damage propagates through generations. Homer and Bart are genuinely similar in ways that neither of them is fully comfortable acknowledging. They are both impulsive. They are both driven by immediate reward over deferred gratification. They are both bad at asking for what they need and then resentful when they do not get it. They both mask vulnerability with performance. Homer with bluster, Bart with defiance. And they are both, underneath all of that, people who love fiercely and loyally and with a totality that their limited emotional vocabulary does not always allow them to express. The strangling is the show's compressed symbol for all of this. Two people who love each other and cannot talk about it getting their feelings out through physical contact, because physical contact is the language they share. The comedy of it is real. But so is the thing underneath the comedy, the frustration of two people who are too similar to connect easily and too attached to stop trying. The episode Bart Gets an F remains one of the series' most emotionally precise pieces of storytelling. Bart faces being held back a grade, and the episode is remarkable because it takes his academic failure seriously rather than as a punchline. It shows him trying, genuinely trying, in a way he rarely has before, and it shows Homer trying with him sitting down at the kitchen table with a son he does not understand, trying to help with material he himself barely grasped the first time, motivated entirely by the desire to be useful to his kid. It is one of the few episodes where their relationship functions without the mediation of conflict. They are just a father and a son, trying to do a difficult thing together, the father limited by his own intellectual constraints, the son by his own particular kind of processing, both of them making the effort because they love each other, and the effort is what love looks like when you do not have better words. When Bart ultimately cries, when the weight of his failure and his effort and his fear of disappointing people comes out all at once, it is one of the show's most quietly devastating moments. Because Bart does not cry. The performance of toughness he maintains is so consistent, so integral to his identity, that when it fails, it registers as a kind of catastrophe. And Homer's response, awkward, imperfect, entirely right, is to simply be there, not with wisdom, not with solutions, just with presence. Bart's friendships are another window into his character. His relationship with Milhouse Van Houten is the show's most sustained examination of a childhood friendship, its closeness, its cruelties, its fundamental asymmetry. Milhouse loves Bart more than Bart loves Milhouse, and the show is honest about this without condemning either of them for it. Bart exploits Milhouse's loyalty, sometimes carelessly and sometimes with genuine guilt about it. Milhouse endures this because Bart's friendship, imperfect as it is the most exciting thing in his life, and because underneath the exploitation there is genuine affection that expresses itself in the characteristically Bart way through action rather than declaration, through loyalty when it counts, even when the day-to-day is marked by casual selfishness. The friendship with Sherry and Terry, with Nelson, with the various collections of kids who populate Springfield Elementary, all of them trace variations on the same theme. Bart as a social creature who needs connection desperately and approaches the need with the emotional tools of someone who has not been given very good ones. He is not a cruel child at heart. He is a child whose cruelty, when it appears, is the cruelty of the unexamined, the kind that does not look closely enough at the consequences of its actions because looking closely is painful. The show returns to this repeatedly, the episode where he dissects a frog and encounters unexpected feeling about its death, the episodes involving animals where his defenses lower further than usual, the moments with Maggie where the gap between his performance of toughness and his actual interior life becomes briefly visible. Bart's relationship with Lisa is one of the most interesting sibling dynamics in American television because it holds the full complexity of the sibling relationship without romanticizing it. They do not always like each other. They are frequently unkind to each other in the specific, intimate way that siblings are unkind, the way that requires deep knowledge, because you have to know someone very well to locate the particular vulnerabilities that casual unkindness cannot reach. And yet the episodes that explore their relationship seriously are among the show's most emotionally generous. They need each other in ways they would never admit during ordinary circumstances. When circumstances are not ordinary, when one of them is in genuine trouble, when the stakes are real, they show up for each other with a completeness that the surface conflict makes surprising, and that the accumulated subtext makes entirely inevitable. The America that needed Bart Simpson in 1989 was an America in the process of constructing a very particular cultural narrative about childhood. The good student, the polite child, the deferential, obedient, achievement-oriented kid who organized their life around institutional success. This was the template. Bart was its refusal. Not a productive refusal, not a refusal that had a coherent alternative to offer. Just the raw refusal of a 10-year-old who could not find the point of the exercise and was not going to pretend otherwise. This was threatening to certain kinds of adults in 1989 because it named something. It named the gap between what institutions claimed to offer and what they actually delivered. It named the gap between the civility demanded of children and the genuine respect extended to them. It named the experience of being told that if you just comply, if you just follow the rules, if you just get through it, you will arrive at something worthwhile, and finding that the something worthwhile keeps receding as you get closer to it. Bart did not fix anything. He did not offer a better way. He was 10 years old, and he skated and he made calls to Moe's Tavern, and he wrote on the blackboard every morning as a punishment for things that were entirely worth doing. But he refused. And the refusal was real, and the show never took it back, never turned it into a lesson about why compliance was actually correct, never resolved Bart into the good student the school wanted him to be. He stayed exactly himself, imperfect and limited and genuine. And that is, in the end, what the show was saying about childhood, that the self you are before the world gets through with you is worth preserving. That the kid who will not fit into the structure might be telling you something important about the structure, and that the genuine, difficult, irreducible particular person, the one who does not smooth down or average out, is more valuable than the version of that person the institution is trying to produce. Bart Simpson was the most popular character in the world for a brief, extraordinary moment in the early 1990s, and then the world moved on to other things, and the panic about him faded, and he settled into his role as one member of an ensemble. But the moment of his maximum visibility captured something real. A culture recognized something in him, recognized the refusal, or the desire for refusal, or the memory of a refusal they had once managed before the world persuaded them to stop. And for a moment, It felt important to have a character on television who was allowed to refuse. That feeling faded, but the character remained. And 36 years later, Bart Simpson is still 10 years old, still in fourth grade, still writing on the blackboard, still skating out of Springfield Elementary into a town that has never quite known what to do with him. Still himself, completely, every episode. Still refusing in the specific way that is his alone. That is no small thing. Section 6. Lisa and the Cost of Seeing Clearly. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old, and she has always been 8 years old. And she will be 8 years old, long after most of the people reading this have grown old, and the world has changed in ways we cannot predict, and The Simpsons itself has finally, eventually, inevitably ended. She is frozen there, in that particular year of childhood, old enough to understand most of what the world is, young enough to still believe it could be better, and the show has been using that specific in-between place to say something, across hundreds of episodes, about what it costs to see clearly. Lisa sees clearly. This is her gift and her curse, and the show has never been confused about which of those two things tends to win in Springfield. She sees the hypocrisy of the adults around her, and she names it. She sees the injustice in the institutions she moves through, and she challenges it. She sees the gap between the way Springfield presents itself and what it actually is, and she is constitutionally, organically, foundationally unable to pretend the gap does not exist. She tried, once or twice in early episodes, to be the kid who just gets through it, who keeps her head down and collects her gold stars and does not make a fuss. It never held. The truth would surface. The questions she was not supposed to ask would come out anyway, and she would watch the room close around her, and she would understand, again, that Springfield did not reward this. The saxophone is where this lives most visibly. The saxophone is the thing that is entirely hers, that does not need the world's approval to justify itself, that exists in the space where Lisa's interior life is complete without an audience. When she plays, she is not trying to communicate something to the people around her. She is not performing. She is being fully, in the way that is only possible when the part of yourself you are expressing is the part that predates social accommodation. The show understands this about her. The saxophone scenes are shot and scored and paced differently from everything around them, slower, quieter, with a quality of stillness that the rest of the series rarely achieves. They are the show's most concentrated statement about the value of the interior life, the life that does not need to be witnessed to be real. Lisa's intelligence creates isolation in ways the show examines with sustained care. She is smarter than almost everyone around her, and she knows it, and the knowing is not pleasurable. The pleasure would require peers, would require people who could meet her where she actually is, who could engage with the ideas and the feelings at their actual level, rather than a translation of them for a less demanding audience. Springfield does not provide this. The school curriculum is nowhere near her. The kids in her class are navigating different problems than she is. Even the adults who are ostensibly more sophisticated than her classmates, the teachers, the parents of other children tend to respond to her with a mixture of admiration and faint discomfort. The discomfort of people who recognize intelligence they cannot quite match and are not entirely sure how to relate to it. The substitute teacher episodes are the show's clearest statement about this. When Lisa encounters a teacher who can actually engage with her at her level, who treats her intellectual appetite as something to be fed rather than managed, the effect on her is out of proportion with the event. She falls in love, essentially, falls into the experience of being seen, being met, being acknowledged as what she is rather than as a slightly odd and slightly demanding child who needs to be handled. The teacher, inevitably, leaves. The substitute does not stay. And Lisa is left with the painful after effect of having glimpsed what her life could be like if the world were differently arranged and then watching the glimpse close. She has this experience repeatedly, with a feminist bookshop owner who showed her that intellectual women exist in the world, with visiting musicians who took her playing seriously, with a few teachers, a few episodes, a few encounters that opened something and then closed it again when the circumstances that produced the opening changed. This is the rhythm of Lisa's life in Springfield. Glimpse and loss. Glimpse and loss. The repeated experience of encountering the life she should be living in brief, discontinuous fragments that never join into a continuous whole. The vegetarianism episode is a different kind of case study in what it means to be Lisa Simpson. She decides, on moral grounds that the show presents as completely coherent, not to eat meat. The family does not understand this. Springfield does not understand this. Every social occasion becomes a confrontation between her values and the expectations of the world around her. The show does not resolve this by having everyone come around to her position. That would be false. It resolves it by finding the two people in Springfield who share her commitment and establishing that she is not entirely alone, and by having Apu and Paul and Linda McCartney offer the particular comfort of peer recognition that Lisa almost never gets. She is not wrong. She is not going to stop being who she is. The world around her is simply not calibrated for her, and she will have to carry that. And the question is not whether she can change the world, but whether she can hold herself intact while the world keeps failing to meet her. This is the question the show returns to with Lisa over and over. Can you stay yourself? Can you maintain the clarity and the seriousness and the moral commitment when the environment does not reward any of those things and occasionally actively punishes them? Can you keep asking the questions nobody wants asked? Keep seeing the things everyone else has agreed to look past? Keep caring about the distance between what is and what ought to be, without being ground down by the friction of caring? The show does not always give her an optimistic answer. It is honest about the toll. Lisa, in her lowest episodes, the episodes where the isolation and the frustration have accumulated beyond what she can easily absorb, is genuinely sad. Not the comedic sadness of a character whose disappointment exists to generate plot. Genuinely, quietly, recognizably sad. The kind of sad that comes from expending enormous effort in a direction that the world is not moving and knowing at some level that the effort will probably not change the direction. What keeps her going is the music and the occasional glimpse. And Marge, who does not always understand her but always loves her. And Homer, who does not understand her at all but is entirely on her side anyway in that uncomplicated total way of his. And, less often than she should have it, but more often than she sometimes fears, the sense that she is right, that the things she sees are real, that the questions she asks matter even when no one around her can hear them. Lisa's relationship with Springfield is the show's most sustained meditation on what it means to be a person of genuine conscience in a community that has organized itself around comfort. Springfield is not a bad community, exactly. It contains many good people, many genuine acts of kindness, many moments of real warmth and solidarity. But it has also developed a profound cultural immune response to any challenge to its comfortable arrangements. Any idea that requires Springfield to change, any observation that requires Springfield to look at itself clearly, any question that complicates the agreed-upon story of what Springfield is and what it stands for, these get rejected. Not violently, usually, but reliably. The social tissue closes around the disruption and smooths it over, and things return to normal, and Lisa is left standing in the space where the question was, holding the question, watching the closure happen around her. Her ambition for herself is one of the show's most carefully maintained threads. Lisa does not want to stay in Springfield. This is not presented as a betrayal of her family or her community. The show is too honest for that easy frame. It is presented as simply true. Lisa has a life that Springfield cannot contain, and she knows it. And the show honors that knowledge rather than requiring her to be smaller than she is. The episodes that imagine her future at college, in a professional context, as a person who has had the opportunity to become who she is fully are, among the show's most emotionally rich, because they give Lisa what Springfield cannot, room. She is also funny. This is worth saying because the seriousness of her characterization can overshadow it. Lisa Simpson is genuinely funny, in a specific register. Her humor is drier than the rest of the family's, less reliant on absurdism or pratfall, more dependent on the comedy of precision, the exact right observation delivered at exactly the right moment, the articulation of something that was already there but had not been named. She has her mother's timing and her father's honesty, and her own particular way of deploying both that is entirely her own. The relationship between Lisa and Bart is the one that most rewards attention over the full run of the series, because it is the one that changes most subtly. They begin as something close to adversaries, the responsible child and the irresponsible one, each finding the other's defining quality slightly incomprehensible. They develop into something considerably more interesting. They are the two people in the Simpson family who are most fully who they are, who have not agreed, the way Homer and Marge have in different ways, to prioritize the family unit's stability over their own particularity. They are both people who stick out. They are both, in their different registers, people who refuse. And that shared refusal, that shared commitment to being specifically themselves, even when it creates difficulty, is the foundation of a genuine bond that the show develops with great care. The episodes where they help each other, where Bart, unprompted by anything except loyalty, goes to extraordinary lengths to restore something important to Lisa, where Lisa, unprompted by anything except love, defends Bart against people who have decided he is not worth defending, are the show's clearest statements about what sibling love actually is. Not the constant, warm, uncomplicated affection of greeting cards, the harder, less continuous, more tested kind. The kind that persists through genuine conflict because it is rooted in something deeper than compatibility. Lisa and Springfield are irreconcilable. The show has always known this. It has never tried to resolve it by making Lisa smaller or making Springfield larger. It holds the irreconcilability honestly and finds in that tension one of its most enduring and most honest stories. The story of what it is like to be, genuinely and specifically and immovably, yourself, in a place that was not built for you, and what it costs, and what it gives in the strange, indirect way that difficulty sometimes gives things. She is 8 years old. She has always been 8 years old. And she has always been one of the most fully realized characters in American television. Both of those things are true. Both of those things are part of what The Simpsons was actually doing. Santha Pound 7, Burns, Smithers, and the Machinery of Power. Charles Montgomery Burns was born in the 19th century. The show is not entirely consistent about exactly when the floating timeline makes precision impossible, but the broad outlines are clear. He grew up wealthy, attended elite universities, entered the industrial world at a moment when the rules governing business were loose enough to allow behaviors that subsequent generations would find astonishing, and has been accumulating power ever since with the single-mindedness of a man who has nothing else to organize his existence around. He is, in many ways, the show's most extreme character. Not in the obvious sense, the show has plenty of physically extreme and tonally extreme characters. But Burns is extreme in the sense of being pushed the furthest in a specific direction, the direction of pure, concentrated institutional power, unchecked by normal human limitation. He is what you get when wealth is allowed to compound undisturbed for over a century, when the person holding it has the will and the resources to extend their own life indefinitely through technological intervention, when every subsequent generation's attempts to regulate or challenge that accumulated power have failed, because the power itself was always several steps ahead of the regulation. Understanding Burns requires separating the comedy from the analysis, because the show packages both in the same delivery, and the comedy tends to get remembered while the analysis gets filed away. The comedy of Burns is rich and has produced some of the show's best material: the tiny, frail body containing the imperious will, the inability to recognize Homer's name, the schemes so elaborate and so disproportionate to their goals that the gap between the power deployed and the end achieved becomes itself the joke. His voice, his posture, his characteristic hand steeple, and the excellent, all of it adds up to a performance of villainy so theatrical it circles back to something more interesting than simple menace. But the analysis, what Burns represents, what the show is doing by making him the richest and most powerful person in Springfield, is the part that deserves sustained attention. Burns represents the answer to the question, what does wealth, allowed to accumulate without constraint across generations, eventually become? Not a person with money, something different. Something that has outlasted normal human time, that has accumulated not just resources but influence structures, that has built systems of dependency so complex and so thorough that the wealth is no longer separable from the context it has constructed around itself. Burns does not simply own money, he owns the conditions under which everyone around him lives. The biological aspect of his survival is, within the show's logic, the most honest statement of what this represents. Burns is kept alive by weekly radiation treatments that would kill a normal person. He has been so fundamentally altered by his proximity to the nuclear material his plant processes that his own biological systems no longer function through normal processes. They require external intervention on a precise schedule without which everything that should have killed him long ago finally will. He is not immortal. He is expensively maintained. He has converted his wealth into a life extension apparatus so effective that it has kept him functional for decades, beyond what any human biology unaided by technology could manage. This is the metaphor the show chose for what extraordinary wealth actually is. Not comfort, not security. The conversion of money into time. The purchase of more life, or at least more continued relevance, more continued operation than the natural order intended to provide. Burns's treatments are the literal version of what his money has always done, kept him running when the normal forces of entropy and consequence would have stopped him. His history is the show's history of American capitalism in concentrated form. He entered the economy in an era before meaningful labor regulation, before environmental law, before the regulatory infrastructure that, however imperfectly, now applies some level of accountability to the behavior of the powerful. The practices he established, the violations, the suppressed safety concerns, the captured regulatory bodies, the purchased political class were not exceptional in his formative era. They were standard. He has simply maintained them past the point where standard became illegal, because his infrastructure for maintaining them was built when they were legal and proved too embedded to dismantle afterward. The plant is the machine through which his power operates in Springfield, but the machine is not the power itself. The power is the accumulated structure, the political relationships, the economic dependencies, the compromised institutions, the population that has been too damaged, too afraid, or too accustomed to its own exploitation to organize coherent resistance. You cannot take the plant away from Burns and solve the problem. The plant is a component of a system. The system is the problem. Smithers is the system's most complex element, and the show handles him with more care than it is sometimes given credit for. Waylon Smithers is Burns's assistant, his social secretary, his medical manager, his only genuine point of human connection. He is also, and the show, developed this over decades with remarkable subtlety for a comedy. A man whose entire life has been organized around an attachment that cannot be acknowledged, cannot be fulfilled, and cannot be released. Smithers loves Burns. The show established this early and has maintained it with extraordinary consistency. The love is comic in its presentation, the devotion, the barely suppressed adoration, the willingness to do absolutely anything Burns requests, but the comedy sits on top of something genuinely tragic. Smithers is a man who has given his life to someone who does not and cannot love him back, and who has made this sacrifice not in ignorance but in full awareness. He knows Burns. He sees Burns clearly, including Burns's incapacity for genuine human connection. He helps Burns maintain the systems of exploitation and control that make Burns what he is. He does this not because he agrees with what Burns does. The show makes clear that Smithers has his own moral compass, and it does not always align with his employers, but because his attachment is prior to and deeper than his judgment. The comedy of Smithers is inseparable from the tragedy, which is, again, the show's most characteristic mode of operation. His complete, utter loyalty, his willingness to absorb personal harm in Burns's service, his elaborate rationalizations for behavior he knows is wrong, these are funny in context. They are also the portrait of a specific kind of emotional captivity that the show takes seriously even as it plays it for laughs. What makes Smithers sympathetic, and why the show ultimately treats him with affection rather than contempt, is the competence underneath the devotion. Smithers is actually good at what he does. The administrative, logistical, and medical management of Burns's life requires real skill, and Smithers brings real skill to it. He is, in a different context, someone whose capabilities would have produced a genuinely successful professional life. The waste of those capabilities, the fact that they are deployed entirely in service of someone who will not and cannot give anything real in return, is a loss that the show registers, quietly, through the accumulated evidence of Smithers being better than his circumstances require. The dynamic between Burns and Smithers is also the show's most concentrated examination of the relationship between power and loyalty. Burns does not maintain Smithers through love. He does not maintain him through genuine appreciation. He maintains him through the fact that Smithers has, over decades, organized his entire existence around being useful to Burns until the possibility of a different life has receded so far that it is no longer practically available. This is not a unique mechanism. This is how institutions, families, relationships, and companies maintain the loyalty of the people who make them function, not through positive reward, eventually, but through the absence of a plausible alternative. You keep the people who have no other place to go. Burns's other relationships in Springfield are all versions of this. His relationship with Springfield's political class, his relationship with the media, his relationship with the regulatory bodies that are supposed to provide oversight of his plant, all of them are maintained through a combination of economic dependency and the accumulated inertia of arrangements that have been in place so long that challenging them feels like challenging the laws of physics. Burns did not construct these relationships through any particular genius. He constructed them by being present, being wealthy, and being patient for longer than any normal human being could be present and patient. The episode where German investors briefly purchased the plant is one of the show's clearest statements about what Burns's apparent incompetence actually is. The Germans come in, fire Homer, conduct a proper safety audit, discover what compliance would cost, and are forced to sell the plant back to Burns at essentially any price he names. The episode frames this as comedy. The Germans are efficient and baffled by Springfield's chaos. The joke is the culture clash, but the underlying mechanism is not comic. Burns's plant is deliberately kept in its current state because bringing it into compliance would cost more than it is worth, and Burns knows this. And the incompetence and chaos and violations that make the plant such an obvious target for satire are, in fact, features rather than bugs. The plant is profitable precisely because it does not spend on safety. Homer is retained precisely because a competent safety inspector would shut it down. The dysfunction is structural. The dysfunction is the model. This is the most unsettling thing the show says about power, and it says it quietly, in the background, through the accumulated logic of a joke that has been running for 36 years. Burns is not failing to run the plant well. He is running it exactly as he intends to run it. The cracked cooling towers are not evidence of negligence. They are evidence of a calculation. And the calculation, made by someone with access to a century's worth of evidence about what Springfield's population will and will not organize against, has always come out the same way. Burns wins because Burns built a town in which winning is built into the structure. He did not simply accumulate power. He constructed the conditions under which his power renews itself automatically, without requiring his active management. That is the difference between being rich and being Burns. Anyone with enough money can be rich. Building the architecture that makes the money self-perpetuating across generations, that embeds itself in the ecology of a community so thoroughly that removing it would damage the community, that makes accountability structurally impossible through the same mechanisms that make the community viable, that is something else entirely. The show's treatment of Burns as a comedy villain, as the theatrical pantomime of evil with the steepled fingers and the memorable voice and the inability to name his own employees, is partly a defense mechanism. If Burns were presented as straightforwardly realistic, the show would be unwatchable. The horror of what he represents, in its unmediated form, is too heavy for a Sunday night cartoon. So the show gives him a voice and a posture and a collection of absurd quirks and lets the comedy do the work of making him bearable. And then, in the gaps between the laughs, it shows you exactly what he is and what he has done and what he continues to do, and trusts the audience to hold both at once. Most of the audience does hold both at once. That is why Burns has been one of the most memorable characters in American television for 36 years. He is funny. He is also, underneath the comedy, one of the most precisely drawn portraits of concentrated institutional power ever put on screen. Both of those things are true. Both of them are what the show intended. Section 8. The supporting cast and the town that holds everything together. Springfield is not just the Simpson family. This may seem obvious. The show has always populated its world with an enormous cast of recurring characters, cameos, bit players, and crowd figures. But it is worth stating clearly because the supporting cast is where a significant portion of the show's most interesting thinking happens. The main family carries the emotional architecture. The supporting cast carries the social texture. And the social texture of Springfield, the specific way its various human types rub against each other and against the systems they inhabit, is where the show makes its deepest observations about community. Let's start with Ned Flanders. because Ned is the character the show has done the most interesting thinking about across its run, and because he represents something the show takes very seriously: the question of what goodness looks like in a world that does not reward it. On the surface, Ned is Homer's foil. He is physically fit, financially stable, devoutly religious, genuinely kind, an attentive father, a good neighbor. He is, by every conventional metric, a better person than Homer, and the show acknowledges this without embarrassment. The comedy of Ned and Homer's relationship has always been grounded in this asymmetry: the genuinely good man who lives next door to the genuinely chaotic man who absorbs the externalities of Homer's disorder with an equanimity that borders on the supernatural. But the show complicated Ned significantly when it revealed the psychological origins of his goodness. Ned was not always gentle. As a child, he was described as chaotic and uncontrollable. Not in the Bart sense, not in the creative mischievous register, but genuinely disordered in a way that alarmed his parents. They took him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist treated him through techniques that the show depicts as extreme conditioning, so aggressive and so sustained that it effectively rewired his emotional architecture. The aggression was suppressed. The disorder was contained. Ned emerged from the treatment as the person he has been ever since: calm, patient, incapable of sustained anger, with a positivity so consistent it functions less like a personality trait and more like a managed condition. This revelation changes everything about Ned. The patience is not natural. The kindness is not unconditional. They are a cage built around a different person or around a younger version of the same person by a doctor who had good intentions and used methods of uncertain ethics. What we experience as Ned's goodness is actually Ned's suppression, and the show is careful to show us what happens when that suppression fails. The hurricane episode, where everything Ned owns is destroyed by a natural disaster, and the community's attempt to help him produces something worse than nothing, is the crack through which the original person is briefly visible. And what emerges when the conditioning falters is not simple rage, but something more complicated and more painful. A man who has spent his entire life following every rule, honoring every obligation, doing everything asked of him by both religion and community, and who watches it count for nothing, and who cannot, in that moment, make the math work. The other thing the show says about Ned, the thing that is easier to miss because it is embedded in a running gag, is that God, who demonstrably exists within the show's universe, who has held actual conversations with Homer on multiple occasions, has never spoken directly to Ned. Homer, the man who falls asleep in church, who treats his faith as a social obligation rather than a genuine commitment, who behaves in ways that are a continuous affront to everything Ned believes in Homer, has met God. Ned, who prays every day, who has organized his entire life around his faith, who has paid every cost the faith demanded without complaint, Ned gets silence. The show does not explain this. It does not resolve it. It sits with it as a fact of life in Springfield, which is to say, a fact of life, period. The devout do not get special access. The genuinely good are not protected from suffering. The universe does not calibrate its attention toward those who deserve it most. And Ned, programmed by his conditioning to absorb this without expressing the grief it should produce, absorbs it. His faith persists, not because it is answered, but because the alternative, the loss of the framework, the open void where the framework was, is more frightening than the silence. Ned is the most complex theological statement in the show. He is a man who believes completely and is not rewarded for his belief, and continues to believe. The show does not celebrate this. It does not condemn it. It presents it as the specific, irreducible, complicated reality of what faith sometimes is in actual lives. Not a transaction, but a commitment, honored in the absence of reciprocation, maintained not because it makes sense, but because the person cannot exist without it. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the show's portrait of institutional incompetence, and again, the comedy sits on top of something more serious. The Springfield Police Department, as an institution, is terrible at almost everything a police department is supposed to do. Cases go unsolved. Evidence is mishandled. Resources are misallocated. The law is applied inconsistently and often in ways that reflect the economic and social power of whoever is calling rather than any coherent standard. Wiggum is at the center of this, not as a villain, but as a product, a man who rose to his position through the path of least resistance, who is not equipped for the job he holds, and who operates within an institution that has been captured by the same forces that captured everything else in Springfield. The show is careful not to make Wiggum simply a buffoon. He has a family. He loves his wife and his son Ralph with a genuine, if occasionally misdirected, care. The episodes that explore his home life show a man who is better at private life than at public function, warmer, more perceptive, more capable of genuine feeling, and this gap between the private man and the public role is itself a statement about what the police department, as an institution, demands of the people who work for it. Ralph Wiggum is a separate study, and the show handles him with surprising tenderness. Ralph is a character whose defining quality could easily become cruelty, the joke of a child so disconnected from ordinary reality that he exists in a register entirely his own. But the show consistently finds the affection in Ralph rather than the contempt. His statements are non sequiturs, yes, but they are also, frequently, accidentally profound in the way that genuinely disconnected observations sometimes are. He does not see the world through the filters that other people apply, and what he says as a result is stranger than what the filtered version would produce, but occasionally more honest. The show treats this with warmth rather than mockery, and in doing so makes a quiet argument for the value of perspectives that do not conform to the expected shape. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon and the Quick E-Mart represent one of the show's most complicated legacies. In the show's best treatment of Apu, he is a man of considerable education, a PhD, from Calcutta Technical Institute who has ended up managing a convenience store through a combination of circumstance and the specific pressures of building a life in a country that does not provide obvious paths for someone of his background and immigration status. The comedy of his character, in its best execution, is not about his ethnicity. It is about the specific indignity of being overqualified for the life you have ended up living, and the choice to find dignity within that life anyway. The Quick E-Mart is not where Apu imagined he would end up. He has made it his anyway, made it a place of genuine quality, managed it with care and precision, invested it with a kind of pride that has nothing to do with what the job is, and everything to do with who he is. The show's treatment of Apu has been the subject of sustained criticism, and that criticism has merit. The accent, the stereotyping in certain episodes, the ways in which the character's foreignness was used as a punchline in ways that are distinct from the comedy of his actual situation, these are real failures. The show's creative staff has acknowledged this, to varying degrees, over the years. But the character at his best is more than a stereotype, and the best episodes involving Apu are among the show's most generous portraits of an outsider finding belonging within a community that does not quite understand him. Mo Sislak is the show's most extended portrait of failure, and I mean this with full respect for what the show does with the character. Mo is not a failed person exactly. The show is careful to show the goodness that exists alongside the evident dysfunction of his life. He is a failed romantic, a failed businessman at various points, though the tavern persists, a failed dreamer, in the specific way of people whose dreams were real but whose circumstances defeated them before the dreams could take shape. He is lonely. The loneliness is not played for simple comedy. It is played as the genuine, persistent condition of a man who wanted things he did not get, and who has been managing the gap between the wanting and the not getting for so long that the management has become its own identity. The calls from Bart, the prank phone calls that are themselves one of the show's oldest running gags, are the show's most compressed statement about Mo's situation. He keeps answering. He keeps being fooled. He erupts in the theatrical anger that the show plays for laughs, and then the next call comes and he answers again. The joke is inexhaustible because the underlying reality is inexhaustible. Mo cannot stop answering the phone because not answering the phone would mean admitting that the bar is quiet, that no one is calling, that the absence of noise is not a temporary condition but a description of his life. Barney Gumble is related to this, and the show handles Barney with similar care. Barney was smart. The show establishes this in flashback. Young Barney Gumble was on a trajectory towards something, a specific tragedy depicted in a single flashback that functions as a creation myth, explains how he ended up at the Springfield bar as its most consistent occupant. Homer offered him a beer. One beer became another. The trajectory collapsed. What remains is a man who contains, somewhere inside the alcoholism and the self-destruction, the person he might have been and who, in his sober episodes, shows that person briefly with a clarity that makes the regression that follows more devastating rather than less. The show's treatment of addiction through Barney is one of its most honest threads. It does not moralize. It does not produce simple recovery narratives. It shows the cycle, the sobriety, and the relapse, and the accommodation of the relapse, and the return to the bar, and the continued presence of the man underneath the addiction, unchanging and unchanged, waiting for the next window of clarity that the circumstances may or may not provide. Springfield as a community is defined by the aggregate of all these people. By the way, Moe's Bar functions as the town's emotional pressure valve. By the way, the school functions as the town's contested space for the formation of the next generation. By the way, the church functions as the container for whatever the town decides it believes about meaning and obligation. By the way, the plant looms over all of it, generating the power and the compromise and the low-level contamination that makes everything else possible. The townspeople as a collective, the crowd that can riot and then forget, that can organize and then disperse, that can hold a moment of genuine solidarity and then return to their individual orbits without apparent memory of what they just shared, are themselves a character. The crowd represents something the show has always understood about communities, that the capacity for collective feeling is real and powerful, and also, in communities under the specific pressures Springfield is under, extraordinarily brief. The crowd comes together, and then the moment passes, and each person returns to the particular isolation of their individual circumstances, and the collective wisdom that was briefly available disperses. This is not a pessimistic statement about people. It is an honest statement about the conditions under which collective action is possible. The crowd in Springfield cannot sustain its solidarity because the conditions of life in Springfield, the economic pressure, the cognitive damage, the captured institutions, the accumulated learned helplessness of living in a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of organized challenge that would change things, to make sustained solidarity impossible. The crowd riots. The crowd forgets. And the show presents this not as evidence of the crowd's stupidity, but as evidence of the environment's design. Springfield is, finally, a portrait of America in the way that all great fictional places are portraits of the cultures that produce them. Not a literal portrait, not a documentary account, but a portrait in the painter's sense, distilled, selected, composed, lit to reveal things that ordinary observation might miss. The supporting cast is the texture of that portrait, the accumulated detail of it, the way the background fills in to create the depth that makes the foreground figures legible. Without Moe and Barney and Wiggum and Ned and Apu and the whole elaborate crowd of Springfield citizens, the Simpson family story would not have the meaning it has. It would be a family drama. With them, it is something larger, a portrait of a specific kind of American life, held up long enough and carefully enough that it becomes a portrait of something larger still. Section 9. Springfield as a mirror. What the show was really saying about America. The Simpsons was always a show about America. Not America in the abstract, not the idealized version or the nostalgic version or the version that appears in political speeches and national myths, but the actual, specific, daily, complicated America of grocery stores and traffic and workplace humiliations and family arguments and the particular background hum of a society that has been telling itself a story about itself for so long that the story and the reality have become difficult to separate. The show premiered at a specific cultural moment, the final years of the Reagan era bleeding into the first years of the first Bush administration. A period of significant economic restructuring, the shift from manufacturing to service economy, the beginning of the deindustrialization of the American working class, the first widespread acknowledgement that the post-war prosperity model had structural limits. The working-class American family of the 1950s and 1960s, the family that had been the cultural ideal, the family whose purchasing power and social mobility had defined American exceptionalism for a generation, was under pressure. The jobs that had made that family possible were changing or disappearing. The economic security that had seemed to be the birthright of the working man was no longer guaranteed. And the cultural responses to this denial, nostalgia, distraction, the emergence of a new entertainment economy designed to be maximally absorbing, were already in full motion by 1989. The Simpsons was, among other things, a response to that moment. Homer Simpson's specific situation, working-class family man, union job at an industrial facility, house in a modest suburb, modest aspirations, genuine love for his children without the economic framework that had previously made it relatively easy to provide for them, was the situation of millions of Americans in 1989, and the show chose to take that situation seriously rather than either glamorizing it or condemning it. It looked at it. It found the comedy in it, and it found the depth. The class analysis embedded in the show is one of its most consistent and least discussed qualities. The show is acutely aware of how class works, not in the academic, theoretical sense, but in the immediate, daily, experiential sense. How the fact of Homer's job and his income and his education shapes every interaction he has with the world. How the gap between the life his income makes possible and the life the culture tells him he should want generates a permanent low-level anxiety that the show consistently and correctly identifies as one of the defining emotional textures of working-class American life. How Burns's power is not separate from Homer's circumstances, but is the direct cause of them. The same economic logic that makes Burns rich makes Homer the way he is. The show's treatment of consumerism is another of its sustained and serious threads. Springfield is a town organized around consumption. The Quick E-Mart, the mall, the fast food chains, the show's equivalent ones, the television sets in every home, running the Krusty the Clown show, and its merchandise empire consumption is the background activity of life in Springfield, the way that time gets filled and desire gets managed, and the gap between what people have and what the culture has told them they should want gets temporarily bridged. Homer's relationship to food is the show's most concentrated symbol of this. His eating is not merely an appetite, it is a form of comfort-seeking, of pleasure-taking, of filling a space that is not actually hunger with the nearest available analog to satisfaction. The show understood, before it was common to talk about it this way, the mechanism by which consumer capitalism manages the populations it depends on. You do not need to keep people happy. You need to keep them wanting. The difference between happiness and wanting is that wanting can be managed, redirected, and monetized, while happiness tends to undercut consumption by satisfying the needs that consumption is trying to address. Springfield keeps its residents wanting in exactly the way that real consumer economies keep their populations wanting through the management of aspiration, through the advertising of better lives just slightly out of reach, through the steady supply of goods that satisfy the immediate desire without addressing the underlying condition. Krusty the Clown is the show's mascot for this mechanism. He is a performer who hates performing but whose face has been attached to a consumer product empire so extensive that his image has entirely replaced his person in the public consciousness. He did not design this outcome. He stumbled into it through the specific comedy of show business and the demands of the entertainment economy. And now his face, not him, the face is on every product that Springfield's children consume, generating loyalty to a brand that is entirely independent of the human being nominally attached to it. Krusty can be miserable. Krusty can have addiction issues and financial problems and be privately contemptible of the children who adore him. None of this matters to the brand. The brand is the brand. The media ecosystem in Springfield is one of the show's richest satirical targets. Kent Brockman, the local news anchor, is the show's portrait of a media culture that has fully absorbed the entertainment over information mandate that the market imposes on all commercial news operations. He is not a bad journalist in the sense of being ideologically motivated or deliberately dishonest. He is bad in the more pervasive way. He is motivated by ratings, by the drama of the story over the accuracy of the story, by the need to fill time in ways that keep audiences engaged rather than ways that inform them. The episode where Brockman, based on a mistranslation from a passing spacecraft, reports the imminent invasion of Springfield by giant ants from space and then moves on without apparent embarrassment when the threat proves false, is the show's most compressed statement about commercial news. Media, the error is not the point. The ease of the move from alarm to normalcy, the absence of accountability, the way the media's relationship to truth is entirely instrumental, rather than foundational, that is the point. News exists to fill the broadcast day. Truth is what happens to be in the content. The political dimension of the show is related and equally sustained. Springfield's political class, the mayor, the various aldermen and council people and officials who appear throughout the series is, without exception, captured. Captured by money, by social pressure, by the simple inertia of being in positions that depend on the continued goodwill of the forces that put them there. Mayor Quimby is the show's avatar for this, a Kennedy pastiche whose corruption is so comfortable and so complete that it no longer feels like corruption. It feels like governance. The distinction between serving constituents and serving the people who fund campaigns has, for him and for the political culture he represents, become entirely abstract. The show was careful to distribute its political criticism broadly. It is not a liberal show or a conservative show in the partisan sense. It is a skeptical show. It is skeptical of every institution it depicts, every authority it portrays, every system it examines. The skepticism is not nihilism. The show consistently cares about its characters and about the outcomes of their lives, and caring is not nihilistic. But the show does not believe in the redemption of institutions. It does not believe that the right people in charge will fix the wrong structures. It believes, based on 36 years of evidence, that the structures tend to select for and then produce the people who maintain them, and that the people who maintain them have, by definition, accommodated themselves to the structure's demands. This is the show's deepest political thought, and it is expressed not through any particular episode's argument but through the accumulated pattern of what Springfield is and how it works. The plant does not clean up because it is profitable not to. The government does not hold Burns accountable because Burns owns the government. The media does not expose Burns because Burns owns advertising. The workers do not organize effective resistance because the conditions of their lives, shaped by Burns and his plant and the captured political and media environment, have eroded the cognitive and social resources that effective organization requires. It is a closed loop. It is engineered to be a closed loop. And the people inside it, Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and the entire population of Springfield, are not stupid for failing to break it. They are inside it. The show's relationship to nostalgia deserves particular attention because nostalgia is one of the cultural forces the show is most interested in and most ambivalent about. The Simpsons is itself a nostalgia object. At this point, people who grew up watching it in the 1990s return to it for the warm, familiar, entirely reliable experience of a world that has not changed. And the show understood from quite early in its run that this was part of what it was. That the unchanging nature of Springfield was not just a production convenience, but a feature that the audience had come to depend on emotionally. The ambivalence comes in because the show also understood that nostalgia, while genuinely comforting, can be a mechanism for avoiding the present. The America that Springfield represents, the working class, stable, suburban America of the mid-20th century, is not fully the America that exists now. The conditions that made that version of America possible, the specific post-war economic arrangements, the union density, the combination of industrial production and affordable housing, and accessible middle-class life that Homer's father's generation took for granted, those conditions have changed dramatically. The show knows this. It registers it in the accumulated texture of Homer's economic anxiety, in the plant's condition, in the way the town maintains the appearance of stability while the foundations are quietly compromised. The show holding Springfield in permanent 1989 while the world around it changes is not a simple celebration of a past that was better. It is something more complex, an acknowledgement of what we hold on to and why we hold on to it, and what the holding costs. Springfield is the America we wanted, the America we were told existed, the America that, for some people and some periods, genuinely did exist. The show preserves it, in the same way that a lot of American cultural production preserves it, because the alternative confronting how much has changed and what that change means is harder. But the show is honest enough to show the cracks. The plant, the violations, the fish with 3 eyes, the man who cannot remember his employee's name because his employee was never quite real to him. That is the mirror. That is what the show was actually doing when it built Springfield and populated it with the people we have spent 36 years watching. It was building the most honest version of the America it saw, not the worst version, not the most cynical version, but the real version, with its genuine love and its genuine dysfunction, and its genuine capacity for both decency and catastrophic self-deception running simultaneously, as they always do in real places and real lives. America became Springfield. The show knew this would happen. The writers, staffed by some of the best educated, most culturally observant people in the American entertainment industry, pointed the mirror at the culture, and drew what they saw with enough fidelity that the culture, over time, started to resemble the drawing. The corrupt power plant, the captured government, the population too distracted and too economically precarious to organize sustained resistance to the conditions of its own exploitation. These were observations before they were prophecies. The show wrote them down, and then reality, running slightly behind the satire as reality tends to do, caught up. Springfield is not a warning. Warnings assume that the audience has the power to prevent the outcome being warned about. Springfield is a description, a sustained, affectionate, unsentimental, deeply serious description of a place and a way of life, and a set of arrangements that the people inside them have not chosen and cannot easily exit. It is the description of home, the specific, imperfect, irreplaceable home that you did not make, but that made you, and that you carry everywhere you go, even when you leave, even when you swear you will not return. Section 10. The Golden Era, the Slow Fade, and Why We Never Left. There is a period of The Simpsons that most fans who were there for it describe with a particular quality in their voice. Not just fondness. Fondness is easy. Fondness is what you feel about a lot of things from your past. This is something more specific. A combination of genuine aesthetic admiration and something that resembles grief, the way you grieve for a time that was complete in itself and is now over. The Golden Era. Roughly seasons 2 through 8, with the heart of it concentrated in seasons 3 through 6, the period between approximately 1991 and 1995. These are the years when the show operated at a level of consistent quality that has never been replicated, in this show or in any animated comedy that followed it. When the writing was so dense, so layered, so simultaneously funny and serious and precise and warm, that rewatching these episodes 30 years later is still a different experience from watching most contemporary television. There is more in them. More per minute, more per line, more per frame. They hold up in the way that things hold up when they were made with extraordinary care by people at the peak of their powers. What made it possible? The question has been asked many times, and the answers tend to overlap in interesting ways. The writer's room of that era was unusual in the specific combination of people. It contained comedy writers with academic backgrounds in mathematics, science, and literary theory, alongside traditional entertainment writers with deep instincts for character and structure. The show had been given enough runway, after the success of its first seasons, to take creative risks that a newer show would not have been permitted. And the subject matter, the American working-class family, the suburban experience, the entire complex of daily life in a declining industrial town was fresh as television material in ways that made the writer's engagement with it unusually energetic. The episode quality during these years is remarkable not just in its peaks but in its floor. The bad episodes during the Golden Era are not bad in the way that later bad episodes are bad. They are merely ordinary television. The good episodes are among the best things American television has ever produced. Marge versus The monorail is funny in a way that feels genuinely effortless, a parody of a specific kind of civic boosterism that somehow manages to also be an affectionate portrait of the town and its people while being hilarious from start to finish. Homer the Heretic finds genuine theological depth inside a premise that could have been purely comic. Cape Fear takes the Sideshow Bob storyline to its logical extreme and produces something that is simultaneously a perfect parody of a film genre and a genuinely tense piece of suspense filmmaking. A Streetcar Named Marge finds a genuine meditation on Marge's interior life inside a parody of community theater and Tennessee Williams. The episodes of this era pile up into a body of work that, taken together, constitutes one of the most sustained achievements in American television. The change, when it came, was not sudden. This is important to understand about the show's decline. It was not a cliff, it was a slope. The quality did not crash in any single season or any single episode. It declined gradually, accumulating over years, as the conditions that had produced the Golden Era changed. Writers left. The show's enormous commercial success created a kind of institutional gravity that made risk-taking more difficult. The animation style changed, becoming more fluid and in some ways more expensive-looking, but losing something in the expressiveness of the earlier, rougher drawings. The plotting became more focused on spectacle and escalation, Homer going to space, Homer traveling to exotic locations, Homer meeting presidents and celebrities and famous artists, and less focused on the intimate domestic storytelling that had been the show's emotional foundation. The Homer of the Golden Era is, in certain respects, a different person from the Homer of the later seasons. Not dramatically different, the character recognizably persists, but the specific calibration of his incompetence and his love is slightly off. The Golden Era Homer was limited in specific, grounded ways that the stories took seriously. The later Homer is more cartoonishly incompetent in ways that prioritize comedy over character. The warmth is still there, but it sits in a slightly different relationship to the chaos than it did in the earlier seasons, and the difference matters. What happened to the show is what happens to all very long-running creative enterprises, eventually. The original creative vision, held with unusual clarity by an unusually talented group, was gradually diluted by the demands of continued production, the turnover of personnel, the shift in the cultural context into which new episodes were being received, and the fundamental difficulty of maintaining any human endeavor at peak level indefinitely. This is not a moral failing. It is entropy. The extraordinary thing is not that the show eventually declined. It is that it maintained the quality it maintained for as long as it did, and that even in its diminished form, even in the seasons that the hardcore fans dismiss as symptomatic of an institution running on institutional momentum, rather than genuine creative fire, it remained capable of individual episodes of genuine quality and genuine feeling. The show found new life, of a different kind, through its engagement with the internet era. The prediction phenomenon, the accumulated clips of moments where the show appeared to have anticipated real events, gave the show a cultural relevance in the 2010s and 2020s that it had somewhat lost as a weekly appointment. The show became a reference library, a meme generator, a source of precisely captioned images that could be deployed across social media to comment on current events with a shorthand that had been built into the culture over 30 years. This is not the same as the show's original vitality, but it is its own kind of presence, its own kind of continued life. The question of why we never left, why the audience has not finally abandoned the show despite the decades of diminished quality, why the ratings have held to a degree that would have been unimaginable for any other show with a comparable trajectory, is the question that most reveals what the show actually is to the people who grew up with it. We never left because we are not watching for the episodes anymore. We are watching for the return. For the specific, reliable, deeply familiar experience of a world that has not changed, while everything else around us has changed enormously. When the couch gag plays and the theme music runs and the family assembles in front of the television, you are not only watching an episode of a cartoon. You are returning to a version of yourself that predates a significant portion of your adult life. You are in the living room where you first watched it, or some composite memory of every place you ever watched it. And the family is there, and the house is there, and Springfield is there, and it is 1993, and it is 2003, and it is 2025 all at once. Because the show exists in a time outside time. This is not trivial. The capacity of culture to provide that experience of return, to give people access to something that was real about their past without requiring them to pretend that the past was better than it was or that the present is worse than it is genuinely valuable. Not every cultural experience needs to be challenging or difficult or demanding. Some of what culture is for is comfort, the comfort of recognition, the comfort of the familiar joke, the comfort of knowing exactly what Homer will do when confronted with a specific situation and watching him do it anyway. The show earned that comfort. It earned it over years of genuine creative achievement, years of honest and serious engagement with the lives of its characters, years of being willing to be sad when the story was sad and dark, when the story was dark and true to its subject matter, even when the truth was difficult. The comfort of returning to Springfield is not the comfort of a lie. It is the comfort of a world that was built with care, that was inhabited by characters who were drawn with love, that told stories about people and places that mattered. The comfort is earned. And the questions the show was asking, the ones about family and work and class and community, and the specific quality of American life, and what it means to be human inside the particular set of arrangements that American capitalism has produced, those questions have not gone away. They have become more urgent. The gap between Burns and Homer, between the person who owns the system and the person the system operates on has grown larger since 1989 rather than smaller. The plant's safety violations have found their real-world equivalents in 100 different industries and 100 different communities. The cognitive damage that prevents Springfield from asking the obvious questions about its own condition has its real-world equivalents too, in a culture whose attention is now more managed and more monetized than any of the show's early creators could have imagined. Springfield is still relevant because Springfield was never describing 1989. It was describing something permanent about a specific kind of social organization and its effects on the people inside it. The specific details change, the structure does not. And the show, by freezing itself in time and running that frozen image against an endlessly changing present, keeps demonstrating the permanence. Every year the world changes, and every year Springfield stays the same, and every year the comparison is legible. The golden era will not come back. The conditions that produced it were specific and unrepeatable, as all conditions are. But what it produced is permanent in the way that good art is permanent, not unchanging, not immune to interpretation and reinterpretation, but present, available, there to be returned to. The episodes are still there. The characters are still there, exactly as they were, exactly as they will always be. Bart still 10, Lisa still 8, Homer still in Sector 7G, Marge still in the kitchen with the expression that holds everything. The house on Evergreen Terrace is still lit from inside. The couch is where it has always been. The family is assembled. And outside the window, the cooling towers are visible on the horizon, rising against a sky that is always the same cartoon blue, generating the electricity and the irony and the quiet, sustained, 36-year-long question about what it costs to live the way we live and what it would mean to live differently. We never left because we could not, because the show put something inside us that will not come out. A way of seeing the world with simultaneous affection and skepticism, with warmth and critical distance, with the ability to find the comedy in the tragedy and the tragedy in the comedy, and to hold both at once without being destroyed by either. That is the show's actual gift. Not the episodes, not the quotes, not the predictions, the way of seeing. That is what The Simpsons was actually about. The long, patient, specific, loving, unflinching way of looking at a family in a town, in a country, in a specific arrangement of power, and asking gently, persistently, without expecting an answer, but without ever quite abandoning the hope of one, what if we saw it clearly? What if we looked at it all the way? What if we let ourselves know what we already know, not just laugh at it, but actually know it and hold it and not look away? Springfield does not answer. It never has. It just keeps showing you the picture and trusting that you are capable of seeing what is in it. The house on Evergreen Terrace. The faded yellow paint. The television's blue flicker. The family inside. The cooling towers on the horizon. It is late. The night is quiet. And Springfield is exactly where it has always been, exactly as it has always been, waiting for you to come back, the same as it ever was, the same as it always will be. That's the show. That's all of it. 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, and all of it, every joke and every tearful moment and every reset and every return was about this. A family in a house in a town, trying to love each other in a world that makes it difficult, failing sometimes and succeeding sometimes, and trying again the next week regardless. The Simpsons is not about Homer's incompetence, or Bart's rebellion, or Lisa's isolation, or Marge's patience, or Burns's immortality, or the nuclear plant's violations. It is not about any one of those things. It is about all of them together, about what it means that all of those things exist in the same place and in the same lives and in the same 30-minute episode that always ends with the family assembled and the worst resolved, for now, until next week, until the couch gag plays again, and the music starts, and the world outside your window falls away for a while, go to sleep. The house on Evergreen Terrace will be there when you wake up. It always is. That is, finally, the whole point. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If you stayed until the end, that means something. Drop a comment and tell me what part of the show means the most to you. I read every one. And if this is the kind of video you come back to, subscribing is the best way to make sure you never miss another one. See you next time. Appendix. The episodes that defined everything. These are the episodes that, taken together, contain the whole show's argument. Not the funniest episodes, not necessarily the most famous, but the ones that most fully embody what The Simpsons was actually doing. If you watch only these, you will have seen the show's heart. Bart Gets an F, Season 2. The first episode to make people genuinely cry. Bart tries, really tries, and the trying matters more than the outcome. The show's first clear statement that it was not just a comedy. Homer the Heretic, Season 4. Homer decides not to go to church and has the best day of his life. God, in this episode, is not punishing or petty. God is curious about Homer, which is the show's most generous theological statement. Marge versus the Monorail, Season 4. The show at its most purely comic while also being a perfectly accurate diagnosis of how communities get talked into things against their own interests. Phil Hartman at his absolute peak. Homer's Barbershop Quartet, Season 5. An episode that says something true about middle age, about the versions of yourself that existed before the life you have now, and about whether those versions are gone or just dormant. Homer was someone before he was Homer. Cape Fear, Season 5. The funniest episode the show ever made. Also a genuinely tense piece of horror filmmaking. The rake scene alone is worth the entire history of animation. Homer Loves Flanders, Season 5. The show at its most complex about the relationship between Homer and Ned. The comedy is real. The discomfort underneath the comedy is realer. Bart Sells His Soul, Season 7. The show's most serious engagement with the question of what a soul is and what it means to have one or lose one. Bart does not believe in souls. By the end, he is not so sure. Mother Simpson, Season 7. The episode about Mona Simpson is the one that makes the whole Burns-Homer-Mona conspiracy explicit. It is also one of the most purely emotional episodes the show ever produced. The final shot, Homer alone on the hill, watching the stars, is one of the best endings in the show's history. Lisa's Wedding, Season 6. A future episode that cares about the present, what Lisa might become, what the family might be, what stays and what changes. The most hopeful thing the show ever made. And Maggie Makes 3. Season 6. The episode that explains Homer's desk at work. What the photos mean. Why he keeps working there. The show's most direct statement about what love is, disguised as a flashback episode about a pregnancy. You Only Move Twice. Season 8. Homer gets a dream job working for a charismatic Bond villain and is happy for the only time in his life. The episode is perfect because it shows you what Homer's life could have been and why he chose what he has, and the choosing is genuinely his. El viaje misterioso de nuestro Jomer, Season 8. Homer eats 2 hot peppers and has a spirit journey, and asks whether he and Marge are truly soulmates. The show's most surreal episode and also one of its most honest about marriage. These 12 episodes are not a complete history of the show. They are not the only good ones. They are the ones where the show most fully became what it always wanted to be. A comedy that told the truth about love and work and family and the particular difficulty and specific glory of being human in the world as it actually is, rather than the world as it is sometimes imagined to be. Put one on tonight if you feel like it. Any of them. The show will hold up. It always holds up. This has been Fall Asleep to What The Simpsons Was Actually About. Now, rest. Extended Section 1. The Mythology of Return. There is a specific phenomenon that happens to people who have watched The Simpsons for a significant portion of their lives. And it does not have a precise name, but you probably know the feeling if you have experienced it. You are doing something ordinary watching an episode you have seen before, or hearing the theme music unexpectedly in a coffee shop, or on someone else's television, or seeing a clip shared online and something happens in your chest that is more than nostalgia. It is more specific than nostalgia. It is the sensation of returning somewhere that has been waiting for you, of being recognized by something that cannot actually recognize you. This is the mythology of return that The Simpsons constructed over decades of consistent presence. No other television show has built this feeling in quite the same way, at quite the same scale, for quite the same span of time. Shows that ran for similar durations tend to be procedurals, law shows, hospital shows, crime shows where the attachment is to format rather than to character and world. The Simpsons is different because the attachment is genuinely to the family, to the specific people, to the specific house and the specific town and the specific way that specific world behaves. The mythology works because the show at its best was honest. It did not earn your attachment through manipulation or through cheap emotional shortcuts. It earned it through work, through hundreds of hours of genuine storytelling, genuine character development, genuine willingness to be both funny and serious, and to transition between those registers with a fluidity that most shows can only manage in one direction. You trust Springfield the way you trust a friend you have known for a long time, not because the friend is perfect, not because the relationship is uncomplicated, but because you have seen each other through enough things that the fundamental quality of the connection has been established. The return mythology also contains something about time. When you watch The Simpsons, particularly the Golden Era episodes, you are in a specific relationship with your own past that is unlike most media consumption. The episodes themselves exist in a perpetual present. Springfield is always now, wherever now happens to be. But your experience of the episodes is deeply temporal. You remember the first time you saw this one. You remember where you were. You remember who you watched it with, or whether you watched it alone and felt the particular quiet pleasure of a joke that lands when there is no one else there to share it with. The show is a temporal object embedded in your autobiography, and watching it now is never just watching the episode. It is watching the episode plus every other time you watch the episode, superimposed. This is not unique to The Simpsons. But the show's combination of the familiar but not boring, the comedic but serious, the affectionate but honest, creates conditions under which this temporal layering is unusually rich. There is always something new to see in these episodes, some joke you did not catch before, some piece of background animation that rewards closer attention, some line reading that means something different at 40 than it did at 10. The episodes are inexhaustible in a way that most entertainment is not, because they were made with enough density and care that there is always more in them than the first pass retrieved. The house on Evergreen Terrace works as a symbol of return precisely because it is never presented as perfect. Homer's house is a decent house in a modest neighborhood. The basement floods. The car is not great. The yard contains evidence of Homer's failed projects. But it is also, unmistakably, a home in the fullest sense of the word, a place shaped by the particular people who inhabit it, defined by their specific presence, warm with the accumulated history of everything that has happened inside it. The couch is not just furniture. The couch is where Homer sits every night, where the family assembles in the classic image, where the couch gag deposits them in some new absurd configuration every week. The couch is a place of return so embedded in the cultural vocabulary that the word couch, for a generation of viewers, carries a resonance it would not otherwise have. What the return mythology says, finally, is something about the need for permanence. Human beings live in time. We are defined by our movement through time, by aging, like by change, by the continuous and sometimes terrifying process of becoming. We watch our parents age and our children grow, and our own faces change in mirrors, and the world outside our windows reorganize itself according to logics we did not ask for and did not approve. And in the middle of all that movement, there is Springfield, frozen, exactly as it was, exactly as it will be. The family on the couch, the cooling towers on the horizon, the television flickering blue. This is not escapism in the pejorative sense. This is not the refusal to engage with reality. This is the legitimate human need for a place that holds still, for a continuity that persists, for something that says, I will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and whenever you come back, exactly as you remember me. The Simpsons has been saying that for 36 years. That is what the mythology of return is. That is why it works. And that is why, no matter how long the show continues or how far it goes from its original quality, there will always be people for whom Springfield is home in some real and specific sense. People who carry it with them. People who, when they need to remember that something has been consistent in a world that mostly is not, can close their eyes and hear the theme music and know where they are. Extended Section 2. The Environmental Argument. The Simpsons was making an environmental argument for 36 years, and most people processed it as a joke. This is not a criticism of the audience. It is an observation about how the show packaged its most serious content inside comedy, inside the running gag, inside the background detail that is easy to treat as set dressing rather than as statement. The environmental argument begins with Blinky, the three-eyed fish, and extends through every detail the show accumulates about the plant's relationship to its surrounding ecosystem. But it does not end with the fish. It extends to the physical landscape of Springfield, to the sky over the cooling towers, to the water that comes out of Springfield faucets and goes into Springfield bodies. The show is meticulous, over its run, about establishing that the natural environment of Springfield has been altered by the plant's operation in ways that are visible and measurable, and that the town, collectively and individually, has decided not to measure. The three-eyed fish becomes a symbol partly because it is so legible. 3 eyes are visible. 3 eyes are countable. You can look at Blinky and see exactly what the radiation has done. The fish does not equivocate. It does not require interpretation. It is a fish with 3 eyes, pulled from a river that receives the plant's runoff, and the evidence it presents is as direct as evidence can be. The show's genius is in what it does next. It shows you that directness and then shows you the town's response to that directness, which is to find reasons not to draw the obvious conclusion. Burns eating the fish on television, declaring it harmless, is the show's first portrait of the specific PR mechanism by which industrial polluters manage their public image. Not denial of the evidence the fish is visibly there, visibly three-eyed, visibly impossible to explain away, but the reframing of what the evidence means. The fish is not an indictment of the plant. The fish is just a fish. A curious fish, a harmless curiosity, a fish that happens to have an extra eye through some undetermined cause that is certainly not the nuclear facility that has been dumping waste into its habitat for decades. And the town, which needs to believe this, which cannot afford the economic and psychological cost of not believing it, believes it. This is the environmental argument at its most precise. Not the simple argument that pollution is bad, everyone agrees that pollution is bad, in theory. The more complex argument that pollution continues because the mechanisms by which communities process evidence about their own contamination are themselves compromised. The people who need to act on the evidence are the same people who depend on the polluter for their economic survival. The institutions that should compel accountability are captured by the same money that funds the pollution. The culture has developed sophisticated and largely unconscious mechanisms for processing evidence that is too threatening to accept, and those mechanisms are so effective that they operate below the level of awareness. Springfield does not decide to ignore Blinky. It simply does not see him as the proof he is. The not seeing is not stupid. It is survival. The environmental dimension extends to the human bodies of Springfield's residents. This is the show's boldest and most consistent environmental statement, and it is made through the visual language of the show rather than through its dialogue. Every character in Springfield has yellow skin. Every character has 4 fingers. Every character has the specific physical proportions and characteristics that the show established as its visual grammar from the very first episode. And the show has maintained, consistently, that when outsiders visit Springfield, when characters from outside the town appear, they look different. More normally proportioned, less distorted. The yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the bulging eyes are specifically Springfield characteristics. The show is telling you this. It is showing it to you clearly. The environmental contamination from the plant has altered the biology of Springfield's residents in ways that are visible in every frame of every episode. The art style is not just the art style. It is the diagnosis. The characters look the way they look because the show decided, early in its run, that the visual grammar of Springfield should reflect what decades of exposure to the nuclear plant's output would actually do to the human beings living in its shadow. This is embedded so deeply in the show's aesthetic that it has become invisible the way the fish had 3 eyes for so long before Blinky made it suddenly legible. The show's environmental argument is not hopeful. It does not posit a mechanism by which Springfield will clean up its water, or hold its polluter accountable, or heal the biological damage that has accumulated across generations of exposure. It posits the opposite, that the conditions which produce the contamination are structural, self-reinforcing, and protected by the same mechanisms that produce every other form of institutional immunity from accountability. Burns does not clean up because cleaning up would cost money that Burns is not required to spend, and he is not required to spend it because the political and regulatory apparatus that could require him to spend it has been captured by his money and the population that could force a different political outcome has been cognitively and economically disabled by the decades of contamination that the unspent cleanup money has permitted. The circle is closed. The environmental argument is complete, and it has been sitting inside 36 years of Sunday night cartoons, dressed up as a joke about a man who can't remember his safety inspector's name. Extended Section 3. What Homer Knew. There is a reading of Homer Simpson that the show supports but never quite states directly, and it is this: Homer knows. Not consciously, not in a way that survives the daylight and the routine and the accumulated fog of his daily existence, but somewhere, in the part of him that is more intact than the part that goes to Sector 7G every morning, Homer knows everything. He knows who his mother was and why she left and whose fault it was. He knows what the plant is doing to his family. He knows that the life he has is smaller than the life he should have had, that the limitation is not natural or inevitable but engineered, that the fog in his mind is not entirely his own doing. He knows, and he chooses not to know, and the choosing is the most human thing about him. The choosing is what makes him a character rather than a symbol. Because the alternative to not knowing is knowing, and knowing means acting on what you know, and acting means challenging the arrangement, and challenging the arrangement means losing what the arrangement provides. The job, the house, the family's continued stability within the system, however compromised the system is. This is not weakness, exactly. Or rather, it is weakness in the way that almost everyone is weak in the face of the same choice. The choice between comfort and clarity, between the life you have and the life that the full truth of your situation would require. Most people, most of the time, choose the life they have. They absorb the evidence of their own exploitation and find ways to neutralize it through humor, through distraction, through the genuine love of the good things within bad arrangements, through the crayon, literal or otherwise, that keeps the most painful clarity at a manageable distance. Homer's knowledge and not knowing is the show's most honest portrait of the psychological life of the working class. Not ignorance, not stupidity. The specific, active, maintained not knowing of people who have too much to lose to afford the full truth of their situation. The show respects this enormously. It never condescends to Homer for the fog. It understands the fog as the output of specific conditions, conditions that were designed to produce exactly this outcome, and it treats the person inside the fog with consistent dignity and love. What Homer knows, in the moments when the fog clears the episodes where the crayon comes out, the episodes where he is sobered by crisis, the moments of genuine clarity that interrupt the routine is painful enough that the return of the fog is comprehensible rather than pathetic. He sees the architecture of his own situation and it is unbearable. Not because he is broken, but because the architecture is. And since he cannot rebuild the architecture with the tools available to him, he takes the tool that is available, the return to not knowing, the reestablishment of the comfortable fog, the choice to be the man he can be rather than the man he might have been. This is the deepest kindness the show extends to Homer. It shows you the choice. It shows you the full weight of the choice, and it does not condemn him for making it. Because the show understood, from the beginning, that condemning Homer for this choice would be condemning most of its audience for the same choice, and that the show's value was not in condemnation but in recognition. Homer knows. The show knows he knows. The audience knows he knows. And everybody, Homer and the show and the audience, has agreed to live with the knowing and the not knowing simultaneously, because that is what you do. When you love someone in the fog, you hold what they cannot hold, quietly, from the outside, and you keep showing up. Extended Section 4. The Saxophone and Other Small Gods. The things the characters of Springfield hold on to are the show's most precise statements about what survives. When everything else is subject to the reset, when memories fade and catastrophes resolve and the same mistakes repeat in slightly different forms, the specific objects and practices and commitments that the characters maintain across the entropy are where the show places its bets. Lisa's saxophone is the clearest of these. She has played since the first seasons. She will play in the last episode, whatever it is and whenever it comes. The saxophone is the thing that belongs entirely to her, not to her role in the family, not to her relationship with Springfield, not to any of the social or institutional pressures that shape every other aspect of her existence. When she plays She is not in negotiation with the world. She is simply herself, fully, in the only way she has found to be fully herself without apology. The objects of devotion that the characters maintain are numerous, and each of them tells you something essential. Homer's food is not just appetite. It is the most immediate and reliable source of pleasure available to a man whose other sources of pleasure have been systematically limited or compromised. The donut, specifically, is the show's most quoted symbol, and it works because it is so honest. The donut is not glamorous. It is not even particularly good, in the absolute sense. It is the specific, modest, entirely real pleasure of a specific, modest, entirely real person. Homer does not want truffles. He wants a donut. And the wanting is genuine, and the satisfaction is genuine. And the fact that it is a donut rather than something grander is not a diminishment but a portrait. Marge's painting is the object the show gives her as the token of the self beneath the role. She paints when she has permission to, and the painting is always better than anyone expects. Because Marge is always better than her role requires, and the painting is the form through which the excess self has permission to exist. The show uses Marge's painting to make an argument about the suppression of creative and intellectual potential in the domestic economy, the way that the full range of a person gets narrowed, over time, to the functions the household requires, and the way that the narrowed person persists inside the functions, waiting for the moments when the functions ease enough to let the rest through. Bart's skateboard is freedom. That is the whole analysis. The skateboard is the vehicle through which he exits the building, the school, the institutional space, and enters the world that the institution cannot control. Every shot of Bart on the skateboard is a shot of someone moving at a speed the system cannot match, in a direction the system did not specify, with a level of physical risk and physical pleasure that the system would prefer he manage differently. He is not going anywhere in particular. He is going. That is sufficient. The small gods of Springfield, the objects and practices and rituals that the characters hold against the entropy, are the show's most generous gift to its audience. They are the argument that even in compromised circumstances, even in a town that is doing things to you that you do not fully understand, even in a life that is smaller than it should be, the thing that is entirely yours still exists. The saxophone, the painting, the skateboard, the donut, the specific, irreplaceable, particular pleasure that belongs to you and no one else, that the system cannot take because it did not issue it, that persists through every reset because it predates the system and will outlast it. This is what the show was actually saying about how to survive. Not through resistance exactly, though resistance has its value, through the maintenance of the specific thing that is yours. The thing that, when you do it or hold it or return to it, reminds you that you are more than your function, that you were something before the role and will be something after the role, that the self underneath the arrangement is real. Springfield is full of people who have found their specific, irreplaceable thing. Moe has his bar, terrible as it is, genuinely his. Ned has his faith, inadequately rewarded as it is, genuinely held. Grandpa has his stories, however unreliable, genuinely experienced. Burns has his empire, however monstrous, genuinely his life's work. Even the characters defined primarily by their suffering have, somewhere in the landscape of their existence, the specific small thing that is entirely theirs. The show honors all of these things, not by presenting them as adequate compensations for everything that is wrong, but by presenting them as real, as genuinely valuable in themselves, regardless of context. The saxophone is not less beautiful because Springfield is contaminated. The donut is not less satisfying because the plant has 342 violations. The skateboard is not less free because Bart will still be in 4th grade next week. The small gods of Springfield are the show's faith statement, the belief that even in the worst circumstances, the specific particular human life, with its specific particular pleasures and attachments and capabilities, retains its value. That it is worth something, not in spite of its limitation but fully including it. That Homer is worth Homer, not the Homer he could have been, not the unradiated, uncrayoned, fully intelligent Homer who might have done different things with a different life. This Homer, with this life, in this town, eating this donut. That is the most radical thing the show ever argued. And it argued it for 36 years, in the background, in the running gag, in the yellow-skinned, four-fingered, perpetually present family on the couch in the house on Evergreen Terrace. Every episode, every reset, every return, this is worth it. These people in this arrangement, with this love, worth it. Extended Section 5. Lisa, the saxophone, and the unfinished education. There is a conversation about education embedded in The Simpsons that runs parallel to the main storytelling for the entire length of the show, and it is one of the more serious conversations in American popular culture about what schools are for and what they do and whether those two things are the same. Springfield Elementary is the show's portrait of the American public school in a specific kind of town underfunded, structurally resistant to change, staffed by a mixture of the genuinely dedicated and the genuinely exhausted, operating under policies that reflect the priorities of people who do not attend it and do not have to live with the consequences of those priorities. It is not a terrible school in the way that would make for dramatic storytelling. It is terrible in the more ordinary way, in the way of an institution that has been defunded and demoralized and left to manage with insufficient resources for long enough that the deprivation has become the institution's own identity. The teachers of Springfield Elementary are individually drawn with considerable care. Principal Skinner, whatever the complications of his biography, is a man who genuinely cares about the school as an institution. His investment in it is real, even if his methods are bureaucratic and his vision is limited. He wants the school to work. He wants the students to learn. The gap between his intentions and his outcomes is the gap that the institutional conditions he operates within produce, not the gap of a man who does not care. Miss. Krabappel's relationship with Bart is the show's most precise examination of what happens when a teacher and a student are fundamentally mismatched, not in terms of intelligence or potential, but in terms of the kind of engagement the student needs and the kind of engagement the teacher's circumstances allow her to provide. She is not indifferent to Bart. She is not cruel to Bart in any sustained way. She is depleted. The specific occupational depletion of someone who began with genuine commitment and has been ground down by years of institutional underfunding, parental indifference, administrative pressure, and the daily, grinding reality of managing a classroom full of children whose needs exceed the system's capacity to address them. The tragedy of Krabappel and Bart is the tragedy of a good student and a good teacher in a system that does not support either of them adequately. Bart is capable of more than the system extracts from him. Krabappel is capable of more than the system allows her to give. They are both diminished by the institution in specific ways, and the comedy of their antagonism is the cover under which the show presents this diagnosis, without turning the episode into a policy argument. Lisa's educational experience is different from Bart's but ultimately produces some of the same effects, which is itself an observation about the limits of the institution. Springfield Elementary is not equipped for Bart because he is below its threshold in the specific ways the institution measures. It is not equipped for Lisa because she is above its threshold in the specific ways the institution measures. The institution, like most institutions, is optimized for the median. The students who deviate from the median in either direction, whether by being less conventional or more capable than the system assumes, are left to manage the deviation on their own. Lisa's gifted education, in the episodes that address it directly, is presented with gentle but persistent skepticism. The gifted programs she encounters tend to be institutions within institutions, places that have identified the exceptional students and separated them from the general population, not always to the benefit of the students themselves. Separation from peers, even peers who cannot meet you where you are intellectually, is its own kind of damage. The social development that happens in ordinary classrooms, the practice of existing in a world that contains people unlike you, is something that accelerated programs often sacrifice without fully accounting for the cost. The show's education argument converges on a single observation. The institution of school, as Springfield Elementary represents it, is designed to produce a specific kind of graduate, compliant, measurably proficient in the subjects the institution values, socialized to the institutional expectations of punctuality and deference and orderly behavior, and sorted into the rough categories that the economy downstream of the school will require to fill its various roles. Bart resists this production process and is punished. Lisa exceeds it and is, in a different way, failed by it. The institution cannot imagine either of them fully, cannot serve either of them fully. because the institution was not built to imagine or serve the full range of human capability and human experience. It was built to produce the average at scale. This is not a radical critique. It is not even unusual in the literature on education. But the show embeds it inside the comedy of Springfield Elementary, inside the running jokes about Bart's grades and Krabappel's marking, and Skinner's administrative anxieties in a way that makes it accessible and legible to audiences who would not sit through a policy argument. The critique lives in the texture of the storytelling, in the accumulated evidence of what the institution does to the students it serves, in the gap between what Lisa needs and what the school provides, and what Bart needs and what the school provides. The gap is the argument. The gap is always the argument. Extended Section 6, Springfield's Forgotten and the Weight of the Invisible. One of the things the show does that is easy to miss because it is done so quietly and so consistently is take its background characters seriously. Not all of them, not always, but in the aggregate across hundreds of episodes, Springfield's secondary and tertiary characters accumulate a substance that most shows do not bother with. They have biographies. They have occupational histories. They have specific ways of being wrong about things and specific ways of being right about things. They live in the same town, under the same pressures, in the same shadow of the cooling towers, and the show's attention to them, however intermittent, constitutes a statement about the value of the people whom the main narrative does not foreground. Patty and Selma Bouvier are the most developed of these. They exist, in the show's structural logic, primarily as foils for Homer, the people who have never believed he was good enough for their sister, the representatives of the alternative life Marge might have lived if she had married someone with a steadier resume and a better memory for special occasions. But the show gives them their own interior lives, their own disappointments, their own compromises, and their own pleasures. They smoke in every episode, and the smoking is a joke, but it is also a portrait two women managing the specific quality of their specific lives through the particular comfort of a specific habit, and the habit is theirs in the same way that the saxophone is Lisa's and the donut is Homer's. Their jobs at the Department of Motor Vehicles, the specific, low-grade institutional power that their positions confer, the way they deploy that power with a relish that is both comic and comprehensible, this is where the show does its most interesting work with them. They are not terrible people. They are people whose lives have narrowed to a set of circumstances that reward a specific kind of behavior, and they have adapted to those circumstances, and the adaptation has become who they are, at least in the register the world sees. Underneath that, in the occasional moments the show provides, are people who wanted things and did not get them, and who have found what peace they can in the gap. Sideshow Bob is the show's most elaborate portrait of the person who believes they deserve better than the life they have. His villainy is entirely constructed around the specific, personal quality of his grievance, the sense that the world has allocated him a position that does not reflect his actual value. He is educated. He is cultured. He is, in a real sense, more capable than most of the people who have positions above him in Springfield's hierarchy. And yet he is, repeatedly, reduced to the role of the sidekick, the assistant, the second banana, the man whose considerable talents serve someone else's lesser ones. Bart is a 10-year-old, and Bob resents him for being, structurally, his superior. This is not cartoon villainy. This is a portrait of a very particular human experience, the experience of capable people who find that the world's allocation of positions and rewards does not correlate with capability told through the extreme, operatic registers of a recurring comic antagonist. What makes Bob sympathetic, and why the show maintains the sympathetic dimension across decades of attempted murder and various felonies, is that his assessment of his own situation is not wrong. He is better than his circumstances. The show knows this. The audience knows this. Bob knows this. The gap between what Bob is and what Springfield has given him to work with is real, and it is unjust, and it is also no excuse for anything, and the show holds all three of these truths simultaneously with characteristic refusal to simplify. The recurring image of Hans Moleman, tiny, nearly sightless, enormously old in apparent terms, despite his reported 31 years, subject to a continuous series of catastrophic events from which he reliably recovers, is the show's most compressed portrait of the invisible. Moleman is the person nobody sees until something terrible is happening to them and then forgets immediately after. He is the background figure who accumulates damage without attracting notice, who suffers without generating concern, who exists in Springfield's social ecology in exactly the way that the most economically and socially marginal people exist in any community present, acknowledged when unavoidable, forgotten as quickly as attention can manage. The comedy of Molman's endless deaths and recoveries operates on two levels simultaneously, as so much of the show's comedy does. The surface level is pure absurdism, the same small figure suffering the same catastrophic range of fates in an endless cycling loop. But the level beneath the surface is about invisibility. About what it means that the same person can die, repeatedly, visibly, in front of witnesses, and the community's response is never accumulating concern or organized action, but always the same immediate return to normal. Molman dies and Springfield resets. The reset is the joke, and the reset is the point. The show populates its background with hundreds of these figures, characters who appear once, twice, intermittently across the years, who carry in their brief appearances the suggestion of a full life that the show does not have time to fully render. The schoolchildren of Springfield Elementary, each with their individual quirk and their individual place in the social ecology of childhood. The residents of the Springfield Retirement Castle, each managing the specific indignities of their stage of life within the specific, underfunded institutional context the show depicts. The workers at the plant, the people at the bar, the congregation at the church, the citizens gathered at the various town meetings that the show convenes when the plot requires a democratic mechanism, these people are Springfield, not the Simpson family, not Burns, not Ned Flanders or Chief Wiggum or any of the named, recurring supporting characters. The background, the texture, the accumulated humanity of the crowd, this is what the town is made of. And the show's treatment of this crowd, its insistence on giving even the most peripheral figures moments of particularity, its refusal to reduce Springfield's population to a generic background mass, is its most democratic gesture. Its most consistent statement that the lives happening at the margins of the narrative are real lives, with real weight, whether the narrative foregrounds them or not. Extended Section 7. The Comedy of Recognition. There is a specific mechanism by which The Simpsons' humor works at its best, and it is worth being precise about it because it is different from the mechanism of most comedy. Most comedy operates through surprise, the unexpected turn, the wrong expectation, the suddenly inverted assumption. The Simpsons does this too, often brilliantly, but its deepest comedy operates through something almost opposite, through recognition. The recognition joke is the joke that makes you laugh because you already knew it. Not because it surprised you, but because it named something you had already experienced or observed without quite having the language for. The joke is not a discovery. It is a confirmation. And the laugh that it produces is different from the surprise laugh. It is warmer, more sustained, closer to relief than to shock. The relief of being seen. The relief of someone finding the words for the thing you knew but could not say. The Simpsons built its golden era on recognition jokes. Homer complaining about work in a way that named the specific, inarticulate dissatisfaction of people who spend their days in jobs that do not fit them. Marge expressing her anxieties in a way that captured the specific texture of the maternal worry that goes unnamed in most portrayals of family life. Lisa's frustration at being correct and ignored, naming the experience of every smart kid who ever sat in a classroom waiting to be recognized. Bart's resistance, naming the experience of every kid who ever found the institution's demands disconnected from anything that mattered. The recognition joke requires something unusual from the writer. The ability to observe clearly and then describe what has been observed with enough precision that the description lands on the specific experience of the audience rather than a generalized version of it. This is harder than it sounds. The comedy that misses, that settles for the category rather than the specific instance, produces not recognition but the hollow feeling of being told how you feel rather than shown it. The comedy that finds the specific, the precise, the exactly right detail that produces the genuine recognition, the laugh of confirmation. The writers of the Golden Era were extraordinarily good at this. They were observant in the specific way of people who had thought carefully about the subjects they were writing about, who had lived in working-class or middle-class households and knew what those households felt like from the inside, who had been children in American schools and knew what that felt like from the inside, who had watched American television and absorbed American culture and could see both clearly enough to describe them with precision. The recognition joke is also why the show has aged well in ways that pure surprise comedy tends not to. Surprise comedy requires novelty, it must produce the unexpected, and the unexpected cannot be produced by the same move twice. But recognition comedy does not wear out in the same way. The recognition of something true does not fade with repetition. If anything, it deepens. The Homer joke about work that was funny in 1993 because it named something true about the experience of working is still funny in 2025 because the something true has not gone away. The conditions it names have, in many respects, become more pronounced rather than less. The recognition is not just of a past experience but of a persistent condition, and the comedy of a persistent condition becomes more resonant as time confirms its persistence. This is part of why people return to the Golden Era episodes, specifically. Not just for the nostalgia, though the nostalgia is real, but because those episodes are dense with recognition comedy that produces, on each viewing, a different specific recognition depending on where in your life you are. The Bart jokes land differently at 10 than at 30. The Homer and Marge dynamic resonates differently before marriage than after it. The Lisa isolation produces different recognition at different stages of isolation in one's own life. The episodes have layers, and the layers are accessible at different moments, which means the episodes are never fully exhausted no matter how many times you have seen them. The show's recognition humor was also, always, a form of solidarity. The joke says, "I see this too. I know this too. You are not alone in this." The specific quality of the American working class experience that the show depicted, the economic anxiety, the institutional indignity, the particular combination of love and limitation in the family unit, was not widely depicted on television before The Simpsons arrived. The audience that recognized itself in Springfield was an audience that had not previously seen itself on the screen with that particular honesty, that particular absence of condescension, that particular willingness to find the comedy in real difficulty without using the difficulty as the butt of the joke. That is the show's democratic achievement, not the political satire, which was real and important, not the celebrity cameos or the elaborate plots or the cultural influence. The democratic achievement was in the recognition. In saying, to an audience of people whose lives were primarily happening at the middle and the working class of American society, your life is interesting. Your life is worth telling. Your specific, particular, unspectacular daily experience contains comedy and tragedy and beauty that are worth the attention of good writers and skilled artists. You are not the background. You are the story. Springfield said this for 36 years. It is saying it still. Extended Section 8. What the show did with time. The Simpsons' relationship with time is one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of the show, and it has been consistently underexplored in the decades of analysis the show has generated. The floating timeline is usually treated as a production convenience or as a source of continuity errors, or, in the more elaborate theoretical frameworks, as evidence for the coma theory or the radiation theory. But there is a fourth way to think about it that the show itself gestures toward without ever making fully explicit. The floating timeline is a statement about memory, specifically about collective memory, about the way communities maintain their identity through what they choose to remember and what they choose to forget, about the relationship between narrative stability and social cohesion. Springfield does not age because Springfield maintains a specific version of itself through an active process of collective agreement. The town knows what it is. It knows what it has always been. The version of Springfield that exists in any given episode is not the only version that could exist. It is the version that Springfield, collectively, has agreed to inhabit. This is not entirely different from how real communities maintain their identities. Towns have narratives about themselves. They have agreed upon histories, agreed upon stories about what they are and where they came from, and what makes them distinctive. These narratives are maintained through repetition, through the social processes that transmit and confirm and occasionally revise the story, and through the quiet exclusion of evidence that contradicts the preferred version. Springfield is unusual only in the degree to which this process is visible and in the speed with which contradicting evidence is absorbed and neutralized. The town's relationship with its own history is the subject of some of the show's most interesting episodes. The backstory of the town itself, its founding, its naming, its relationship to the various waves of American history that have passed through or over it is treated with characteristic inconsistency, which is its own kind of statement. Springfield does not have a fixed history any more than it has a fixed geography. Its past is as subject to revision as its present, available to be reshaped by whatever the current episode requires, without any obligation to maintain consistency with previous versions. This is the floating timeline extended backward. Not just the present is unstable, but the past as well, and both are unstable in the same way, through the same collective process of agreed-upon revision. The episodes that deal explicitly with the town's history are interesting precisely because they keep producing different histories. The founding fathers of Springfield are multiple and contradictory. The town's relationships to significant historical events keep changing. The origin stories of major institutions, the school, the plant, the police department, do not hold consistent shape across their various tellings. The show accumulates these inconsistencies without attempting to resolve them, because the inconsistency is itself the statement. Springfield's history is whatever Springfield needs it to be at any given moment. What this says about memory is something the show takes seriously even as it plays it for comedy. Memory is not a recording, it is a practice. Communities do not remember their pasts the way archives preserve documents. They remember through the active, continuous process of retelling, and retelling is always selection and emphasis and sometimes revision, shaped by the needs of the present moment rather than by the demands of accuracy. The Springfield that believes itself to be a normal, if eccentric, American town is not wrong, exactly. It is normal, if eccentric, by its own continuous definition of what normal means. The abnormalities are real, but they have been processed into the town's identity in ways that neutralize their threatening quality. The three-eyed fish is Springfield's quirky fish. The glowing billionaire is Springfield's eccentric employer. The impossibly long-lived, impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful man who controls the electricity and the politics and the economic conditions of the entire community is simply the town's complicated local character. The show's use of time also encompasses its relationship to its own history. The Golden Era episodes exist in a different temporal relationship to the current audience than they did to the original audience, and the show has been in a complicated ongoing negotiation with its own past for decades. The current season of the show exists in the shadow of the earlier seasons. Every episode is implicitly compared to what the show was at its best, and most episodes are found wanting by that comparison, and this finding wanting has itself become part of the show's public identity. The long, slow decline narrative is now as well established as the golden era it contrasts with. But this narrative, the fall from grace story, is also a simplification. The show did not simply decline, it changed. Some of what it lost was quality, genuine creative quality that could not be replaced as the conditions that produced it changed. Some of what it lost was freshness, the novelty-dependent portion of its appeal that time consumed. But some of what appeared to be lost was simply difference, a different mode of storytelling, a different set of concerns, a different relationship to the audience that the earlier mode had defined. Not all of it was worse. Some of it was simply different, and the difference was processed as decline by audiences who had learned to expect the earlier mode. The show's history is as complicated and as subject to revision as Springfield's history. The canonical golden era is real. Those episodes are as good as their reputation suggests. The decline narrative is real. The show is not the show it was in 1993. But neither story is complete, and neither tells you everything you need to know about what the show has been, and what it has done, and what it continues to be. The show is 36 years old. Its relationship to its own history is as complicated as the relationship of any 36-year-old thing to what it was when it was young. That is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to understand. Extended Section 9. The language Springfield gave us. One of the show's most durable and least discussed achievements is the degree to which it altered the English language. Not just through catchphrases, though the catchphrases are real and have had remarkable longevity. D.O. was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001, which is a remarkable thing for a fictional exclamation to achieve. The linguistic impact is deeper than catchphrases. The show gave its audience a vocabulary for experiences and observations that did not previously have efficient names. The naming function of comedy is one of its most valuable social contributions. When something is named, when a precise, memorable, replicable phrase is attached to a specific experience or observation or type, it becomes more available. You can discuss it. You can recognize it in new contexts. You can share it with other people who will also immediately know what you are talking about. The name creates a community around the named experience, a shorthand that connects people who have had the same experience and previously had no quick way to acknowledge the connection. The Simpsons created dozens of these names, not just the catchphrases, but the characters and situations that became reference points. That's a very Skinner thing to do. Communicate something precise about a specific kind of anxious institutional authority without requiring any additional explanation to anyone who has absorbed the show's portrait of Principal Skinner. Very Burns of him communicates a specific kind of elaborate, disproportionate, theatrically malevolent overreach. I'm pulling a Homer means something specific about a specific kind of blundering, good-natured catastrophe. The show created a lexicon for the American experience that has been in continuous use for 36 years. And the continued currency of that lexicon is evidence of the continued accuracy of the observations it encodes. The observations are not dated. The types they describe are not historical artifacts. Skinner is still recognizable. Burns is still recognizable. The specific quality of Homer's well-meaning disaster is still entirely recognizable to anyone living in the world the show was describing. This linguistic contribution is also the show's most invisible achievement because it has been so thoroughly absorbed into the general culture that its origins are often not acknowledged. The references are made without attribution. The observations are deployed without anyone pausing to note that they come from an animated sitcom that has been running since 1989. The show has become part of the substrate, the underlying layer of cultural reference that people draw on without fully tracking where the references come from. This is, in some ways, the most complete form of cultural success available. The work has dissolved into the language. The specific achievements are no longer visible because they have been absorbed. You cannot point to the moment the observation became available, because the observation has been available for so long that it seems to have always been there. The Simpsons did not create American culture, but it became part of the structure of American culture in a way that altered the structure, made new things legible, gave people new tools for describing their own experience. And those tools have been in continuous use for 36 years. The show's effect on humor itself is another component of this linguistic contribution. The specific comedic sensibility the show developed, the layered joke that works on multiple levels simultaneously, the absurdist exterior containing serious interior, the willingness to be both very funny and very sad in the same scene influenced an entire generation of comedy writers and comedians. The DNA of The Simpsons writers' room runs through American comedy for the past 3 decades in ways that are often not fully acknowledged. The sensibility is in the culture now, available to anyone who wants to use it, without anyone needing to cite the source. What the show gave the language, finally, is a set of tools for being honest about specific, difficult experiences while keeping them survivable. The comedy that names the thing you cannot otherwise talk about. The joke that says, "I see this too," and we can laugh at it. And the laughter does not mean we are not also sad about it, and the sadness does not mean we cannot also find it funny, both at once. Always both at once. This is the Simpsons sensibility, and it is now part of how a significant portion of the English-speaking world processes its own experience. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Extended Section 10. Why Springfield Will Never End. The Simpsons will eventually end. This is the only certainty available about it, that the specific commercial and institutional arrangements that have kept it in production for 36 years will eventually change, that the voice actors will eventually retire or be unavailable, that the audience will eventually thin to a point where the economics no longer support continued production, that Fox will eventually make a different calculation about whether the costs of producing the show are justified by the returns. All of this will happen. The question is only when, and the answer is not yet. But what will ending mean? What does it mean for a show that has been deliberately structured to resist ending, that has built its identity around permanence, that has made the refusal to conclude one of its defining characteristics? The show has imagined its own ending several times in dream sequences, in flash forwards, in the elaborate framing devices of certain special episodes, and each time it has retreated from the imagining back into the permanent present. Each time it has said, Not yet. Not this, the story continues. When the show does end, and it will end, the ending will be the most significant event in its history, precisely because the entire history of the show has been organized around the avoidance of this event. The ending will mean something different for The Simpsons than it means for any other show, because no other show has staked so much on its own continuation. The ending will be the one thing the show could not reset, the one consequence that does not resolve by the next episode. What will survive the ending is a different question, and the answer is considerable. The 36 seasons of episodes will survive, and they will be available to anyone who wants them, and they will be argued about and analyzed and returned to and taught in classrooms and referenced in other works and sampled in music videos and used as shorthand in conversations for as long as the cultural memory of the English-speaking world extends in any direction we can currently project. The episodes are the show's actual legacy, and they are already complete. The ending will not add to them or subtract from them. It will simply mark the point at which the production of new ones stopped. The family will survive. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie will persist in the culture in the way that certain fictional families persist as archetypes, as reference points, as names that carry meaning beyond their specific episodes. They will be taught to children who have never seen a single episode. They will be understood as symbols by people who have no direct experience of the show. They will be Homering things and Lisa-ing things and Barting things in conversations that do not occur in English, in parts of the world where the show's reach is just beginning to be felt. What will end when the show ends is the specific, particular, entirely irreplaceable experience of Springfield as a living thing. Not as an archive, not as a reference, but as a place that is still generating new stories, still making new claims about what it is and what it sees, still turning up on Sunday nights and adding something to the accumulated portrait of this family in this town, in this impossible arrangement of American life. That specific experience of an ongoing, living Springfield will end, and the ending will be, for the people who have been living with it for 36 years, something like grief. The specific grief of losing a place you could always return to. But the house on Evergreen Terrace will still be there. In the 1,000 hours of recorded history that the show has produced, in the specific episodes that are among the finest things American television has done, in the language and the sensibility and the specific, honest, loving, skeptical way of seeing the world that the show built and then distributed across the culture so thoroughly that it is now part of the substrate. In all of that, Springfield persists. The family persists. Bart at 10, Lisa at 8, Marge in the kitchen, Homer at the plant, Maggie behind the pacifier, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting, the cooling towers on the horizon, the steam rising. The sky, the specific, impossible cartoon blue that Springfield sky has always been. It does not age, it does not end. It is 36 years old, and it is the same age it has always been, and it will be that age when you return to it in a year, and in 20 years, and whenever you need it. That is Springfield. That is the show. That is what it was actually about. The house is still there. Come back whenever you need to. It will always be there when you do. Thank you for watching this all the way through. There is something real about the people who stay until the end. You are the kind of viewer that makes this worth making. Drop a comment with your location and the time you are watching. And if this is the kind of content you want more of, the subscribe button is the easiest way to make sure you never miss one. Until next time, Extended Section 11. The marriage at the center of everything. Homer and Marge's marriage is, when you look at it closely, one of the most sustained and honest depictions of a long marriage in the history of American television. And I want to stay with this for a while because it is the emotional architecture that holds everything else up, and because the show's handling of it is more sophisticated than the casual viewer tends to register. Long marriages are difficult to depict in fiction. The conventional dramatic tools, conflict, resolution, transformation, the arc that moves a relationship from one state to another, do not naturally accommodate what long marriages actually are. Long marriages do not primarily exist in dramatic peaks and valleys. They exist in the sustained middle, in the daily repetition of small choices, in the accumulated texture of years of shared life. The drama, when it comes, matters so much precisely because it arises against the background of the ordinary. The ordinary is not a dramatic category. Fiction tends to skip past it. The Simpsons did not skip past it. The show was built to accommodate the ordinary. Its format, the self-contained episode, the reset between stories, the return to the baseline at the end of every 30 minutes, allowed it to spend time in the sustained middle in a way that a narrative arc-driven show could not. And what it found in the sustained middle of Homer and Marge's marriage was extraordinarily rich. The ordinary in their marriage is specific. It is Homer falling asleep watching television and Marge covering him with a blanket. It is Marge making breakfast while Homer stumbles to the table not yet fully conscious. It is the specific negotiation over money, over social obligations, over the children's needs that characterizes every family's daily management. It is Homer's periodic self-imposed crises and Marge's periodic decisions about how much of her own frustration she can absorb before she has to express it. It is the running argument and the running accommodation and the running return to each other that these 36 years of ordinary life contain. The show is honest about what the marriage costs. Marge. This is important. The show does not ask you to believe that Marge's life with Homer is without cost. The cost is depicted clearly, repeatedly, with specificity. Homer's selfishness has real consequences for Marge. His failures are not always as funny as the show frames them. His tendency to prioritize his own desires over the family's collective needs generates genuine friction that the show acknowledges rather than smoothing over. Marge's patience is a resource that gets depleted and has to be rebuilt. The rebuilding does not always happen easily. The show is equally honest about what the marriage gives her. The specific quality of being loved entirely, without condition, without the ongoing performance of worthiness that other relationships might require. The comedy that Homer's chaotic presence brings into a life that Marge's own temperament would otherwise make very orderly. The sense, which the show returns to with consistency, that whatever the costs, this is the life she chose, and the choice was genuine, and she would not make it differently even knowing everything it would require. The episodes that threaten the marriage, the ones where Marge is seriously close to leaving, where the strain becomes visible and the outcome genuinely uncertain, are the show's most emotionally honest. Not the comedic marital trouble episodes, which are their own kind, but the ones where the show actually sits with the possibility that this marriage might not hold. They work because the marriage has been established with enough substance that the threat is credible. You can believe Marge might leave because you have seen enough of what she has had to absorb to understand the credibility of the limit. You can believe she would ultimately stay because you have seen enough of what the marriage gives her to understand why the limit, when reached, is survivable. The specific quality of their physical relationship is handled with more care than most primetime television manages. The show depicts Homer and Marge as genuinely attracted to each other in a way that has not faded in 36 years, and this is presented as something real and specific rather than as a joke or a euphemism. The desire in their relationship is part of the emotional texture of their marriage, part of what makes the relationship viable against the weight of all the ways it is difficult. The show understood that long marriages maintain themselves through many different kinds of connection, and the physical dimension of connection is among them, and not acknowledging it honestly would be a falseness that would undermine the portrait. What makes the marriage the center of the show, finally, is that it models something the show believed in, that love is a practice rather than a state, that it is maintained through the daily choices to prioritize it, to return to it, to treat the other person as the specific, irreplaceable individual they are, rather than the function they perform in your life. Homer makes this choice imperfectly, repeatedly, with spectacular failures of execution. He makes it nonetheless. Marge makes it with more consistency and more emotional precision, and the making is not costless and is not automatic. Both of them, every day, in the ordinary, unspectacular middle of their ordinary, unspectacular life, choose each other, not because the choice is always easy, because it is the right choice, and they know it, and the knowing is sufficient to keep choosing. This is what long marriages actually are. The show knew it, and in depicting it honestly, without sentimentality and without cynicism, across 36 years of Sunday nights, it produced something genuinely valuable. A portrait of love as a sustained practice that persists through difficulty, that is shaped but not destroyed by limitation, and that is worth every cost it imposes because the alternative being without it is genuinely unimaginable to the people inside it. Extended Section 12. The Golden Era Writing Room and What It Knew. The question of what produced the golden era, what specific combination of people and conditions and circumstances generated 4 or 5 years of television that stands among the finest the medium has produced, is worth spending time on, because the answer tells you something about what exceptional creative work requires. The writer's room during the golden era was unusual in specific ways. It contained a high concentration of people who had been to Harvard, which sounds like a social signifier more than a creative one. But in this context, what it actually meant was a concentration of people who had been trained to think rigorously about complex problems across multiple disciplines simultaneously. The Lampoon alumni who formed the core of the early writers' room were people who had spent their most formative intellectual years in an environment that rewarded and cultivated the kind of thinking that produces layered comedy. Comedy that works on multiple levels, that contains genuine observation alongside genuine absurdism, that has the density to reward repeated viewing. Sam Simon, one of the show's original creators and showrunner, brought a particular sensibility to the early seasons that shaped the show's emotional architecture in ways that persisted long after his departure. Simon's contribution was, broadly, the insistence that the emotional logic of the stories be genuine, that the comedy sit on top of something real, that the characters not be reduced to comic functions but maintain the weight and specificity of people with actual inner lives. This is a standard that sounds obvious but is remarkably difficult to maintain in the context of weekly animated production, and the degree to which the early seasons achieved it is the degree to which the show earned the emotional responses its best episodes generate. The writers who produced the show's most celebrated individual episodes, You Only Move Twice, Homer's Enemy, A Streetcar Named Marge, Cape Fear, the full list is long, were writers who had found, in The Simpsons, a format that rewarded their specific capabilities. The show was smart enough to be satisfying to smart writers. It was ambitious enough to be challenging. It was commercially successful enough to allow genuine risk-taking without the paralyzing anxiety of a show that might not get renewed. And it was organized around characters deep enough to support genuine exploration rather than the surface-level manipulation of types. John Swartzwelder is probably the most discussed of the individual writers, and with reason. His episodes have a specific quality, a compression, a density, an internal logic that is completely consistent within its own terms, even when those terms deviate dramatically from the terms of the visible world that is not replicated by any other writer on the show. His influence on the sensibility of the golden era is significant and has been documented by other writers from the period who cite him as someone who showed what the show could do with its own internal logic, how far the absurdism could go without losing the emotional thread. The collaborative structure of the writer's room is also part of what produced the quality. The show was not the work of individual auteurs imposing their vision. It was the work of a room where ideas were tested, improved, discarded, rebuilt, tested again, until the version that survived the room's collective scrutiny was demonstrably better than the version that had walked in. This is the ideal function of the writer's room format, and during the golden era, The Simpsons was operating at that format's best. The room made things better. The individual writers brought their capabilities, and the room amplified them. What the room knew, collectively, was the show's deepest subject: the American working-class family, the American suburb, the American experience of being middle of everything in a culture obsessed with its extremes. They knew it from the inside, from direct experience and from the experience of their families and the places they had grown up and the lives they had observed closely. They were not writing about exotic material. They were writing about the world they knew, with the specific combination of affection and critical distance that is only available to people who know a thing from both the inside and the outside simultaneously. This double perspective, intimate and critical, loving and skeptical, comfortable with the material and also able to see it clearly, is the golden era's defining quality. The show loves Springfield. It knows Springfield so well that it cannot romanticize it. These are not incompatible positions. They are the positions of anyone who has stayed long enough with something to see it in its full complexity, and who has enough investment in it to care about the full complexity rather than the simplified version. The golden era ended because things end. The specific people dispersed. The conditions changed. The institutional pressures of enormous commercial success created dynamics that work against the kind of risk-taking the golden era required. This is the normal trajectory of exceptional creative work, and mourning it is appropriate but not the whole response. The whole response includes gratitude for the fact that it happened at all. The golden era was not inevitable. It required specific people in a specific time with a specific combination of talent and circumstance that could easily not have come together. The fact that it did that for a few years in the early 1990s, a group of remarkable writers made something genuinely extraordinary on a weekly broadcast television schedule is not something to take for granted. The work exists. It will keep existing. And anyone who watches it now, for the first time or the 100th time, is in contact with what exceptional creative work can be. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but alive in a way that only things made with full care and full capability and full investment in the subject at hand can be. Alive in the specific way of things that were made to last. Extended. Section 13. The long quiet of the late seasons. The late seasons of The Simpsons are not what the golden era was. This is a fact so widely acknowledged that it has become its own kind of cultural reflex, the automatic invocation of the decline narrative whenever The Simpsons comes up in conversation. But the reflexive quality of the acknowledgement has produced a kind of inaccuracy. The late seasons are not good in the way the golden era was good. They are also not nothing. And the way they are not nothing is worth understanding, because it says something about what the show is when it is not at its peak. The late seasons are the show in maintenance mode. The characters are maintained, the world is maintained, the format is maintained. The essential qualities that made the show what it is, the specific voice of Springfield, the specific family dynamic, the specific relationship between comedy and seriousness are maintained. Not at peak operation, but not absent. The house on Evergreen Terrace is still the house on Evergreen Terrace. Homer is still Homer. The specific way he moves through the world, the specific register of his relationship with Marge, the specific quality of his love for his children, these persist across the decline narrative, maintained by the accumulated investment of decades of storytelling. The late seasons also contain, at intervals, individual episodes of genuine quality. Not consistent quality, the floor is lower, the average is lower, the proportion of memorable to forgettable is lower than it was in the golden era. But the episodes that reach, the ones that find something genuine in the older characters, that discover a new angle on a familiar dynamic, that do something the show has not quite done before even after hundreds of episodes of trying many things. These episodes exist in the late seasons. They are outnumbered by lesser material, but they exist. What the late seasons reveal over time is that the show's characters are so deeply established, their interiority so well rendered across their best episodes, that they can occasionally produce genuine feeling even in the service of lesser storytelling. The characters have weight that was earned in the golden era and that they carry into the late seasons. A Homer episode that is not particularly well written can still produce something real because Homer is so fully established that even a partial rendering of him contains the essential Homer. The investment in the character comes with the character, regardless of the specific quality of the vehicle. This is what it means to be a great character in the deepest sense. Not a character who is only fully themselves in exceptional circumstances. A character whose essential quality persists across the full range of circumstances in which they are depicted, including circumstances that do not do them full justice. Homer Simpson is Homer Simpson in the late seasons. Not at full power. Not with the density and the emotional precision of the golden era episodes, but recognizably, essentially himself, in ways that no amount of declining production quality can fully dilute. The late seasons are also, in their own way, a portrait of something real about long-running things. The way they decline and decline further and persist regardless. The way they maintain the form of what they were after the energy that gave the form its meaning has dissipated somewhat. There is something honest about this. Things do not end at the moment of their best. They continue, in diminished form, carrying the legacy of what they were into circumstances that do not support that legacy fully. The Simpsons, in its late seasons, is The Simpsons being honest about this process not by acknowledging it in the text, but by being an example of it, visibly and over many years. The fans who continued watching through the late seasons were doing something worth noting. They were watching out of loyalty. Yes, loyalty to the characters and the world and the history, but they were also watching out of a kind of hope. The hope that the next episode would be one of the ones that reaches. that the accumulated weight of the characters' histories would, in this episode, be deployed in service of something that justifies having been there for all of it. This hope is occasionally rewarded, not often enough to change the overall quality assessment, but often enough to keep the loyalty credible. That is the late seasons. Not nothing, not everything, honestly somewhere in between. The house still standing, the family still present, the show still the show, in the specific way that things are still themselves even when they are not at their best. The hope that the next episode will be one of the good ones. The occasional satisfaction of being right, extended. Section 14. The gift of the secondary theme. There is a musical theme that plays in specific episodes of The Simpsons during the Golden Era that is not the main theme. You would know it if you heard it. It plays in quieter moments in the scenes between Homer and Marge when the comedy has stepped back and something more intimate is happening. In the scenes involving Marge's interior life, in moments of genuine emotional weight that the show has earned through the preceding story. It is a slower, warmer version of the show's musical identity, and it communicates something that the main theme, with its energy and its iconic brass, cannot communicate. It communicates rest, intimacy, the specific quality of two people in a room together, at the end of a difficult day, return to each other. Alf Clausen's score for The Simpsons is one of the great achievements of American television music, and it is under-discussed in the analysis of the show because music tends to be under-discussed in analysis of anything, processing in the background of the cognitive experience without being consciously registered. But the music is doing enormous work throughout the run of the show. It is holding the emotional register steady during comedy sequences where the dialogue is generating maximum chaos. It is signaling the transitions between comedic and serious modes in ways that prepare the audience for the shift before the shift fully arrives. It is providing the specific warmth that the visual style, which is expressive but not photorealistic, cannot provide through imagery alone. The music is also, in its more ambitious moments, genuinely good music. Clausen brought an orchestral sensibility to a broadcast television format that almost never warranted it, and the result is a score that ranges from playful pastiche to genuinely affecting original composition across the show's run. The pieces that accompany the show's most emotional moments, the end of Mother Simpson, the final scenes of certain episode about Marge and Homer, the montages that the show deploys sparingly, but with great effect when it wants to communicate, the accumulated weight of a relationship are scored with a care and a musicianship that the comedy content rarely requires, and the emotional content always rewards. The loss of Clausen in the show's later seasons, replaced by a different composer with a different sensibility, is one of the under-acknowledged elements of the late season quality decline. The music became functionally adequate rather than specifically right. Not wrong, not bad, but no longer carrying the specific emotional information that Clausen's decades of intimate familiarity with the characters and their world had allowed him to embed in every cue. The emotional subtext that the music used to provide had to be managed through other means, and those other means in the late seasons were not always sufficient. But Clausen's music survives in the Golden Era episodes, and anyone who re-watches them with attention to the score rather than against the score will find a dimension of the show that enriches the entire experience. The music was part of what the show was doing, part of how it held its register, part of how it communicated the specific quality of emotional life in Springfield, the comedy and the seriousness and the warmth and the occasional grief with the fullness that the best episodes achieve. Extended Section 15. The final note. We have spent a long time in Springfield. We have looked at the family and the town and the plant and the power arrangements and the environmental conditions and the educational institutions and the marriages and the children and the secondary characters and the writing room and the music. We have looked at the ways the show was working as comedy and the ways it was working as something more than comedy simultaneously. We have tried to see the thing clearly, in its full complexity, without losing sight of why it matters or letting the analysis displace the feeling. What is left is the simplest thing, and maybe the most important one. The Simpsons was about a family, not a symbol of a family. An actual, specific, particular family with specific names and specific faces and specific ways of loving each other, and specific ways of failing each other, and specific ways of returning to each other after the failures. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, named, present. Consistent across 36 years of storytelling in ways that have made them more real to more people than most actual families will ever be to anyone outside their own households. The show invested in these people. It took their inner lives seriously. It believed that their ordinary, unspectacular, working-class suburban lives were worth this level of attention, this quality of craft, this much care. It told that belief for 36 years and 800 episodes, and it did not stop telling it, and it has not stopped yet. This is the gift, not the satire, though the satire is real. Not the predictions, though some of them were remarkable. Not the cultural influence, though it was enormous. The gift is the specific portrait of these specific people, in this specific place, living this specific life. The gift is that someone looked at this family, this ordinary, difficult, loving, limited, extraordinary family and said, "This is worth telling. This is worth taking seriously. This is worth making something beautiful about." And then they made it beautiful. For 36 years. For 800 episodes. For every person who ever came home from a difficult day and turned on the television and found Springfield exactly where they left it, the family assembled, the house standing, the cooling towers on the horizon, and the television flickering blue through the front window. That is the gift. That is what the show is actually about. The family in the house at the end of the street. Still there. Always there. Rest now. Springfield is exactly where you left it, and it will be there when you wake up. Thank you for watching. Extended Section 16. What it means to watch alone at night. There is a specific experience that this video is designed for, and it is worth describing directly. You are watching this at night. Not necessarily late, but after the day has wound down and the obligations have receded, and the particular quality of nighttime quiet has settled around you. You have a specific relationship with the darkness outside your window and the light of the screen in front of you, and in that relationship there is a version of yourself that is slightly more open than the daytime version, slightly more available to feeling, slightly more willing to let things land. This is the state that The Simpsons was always best experienced in. Not because it required darkness to work, it worked in daylight, on school mornings, in the chaos of family viewing on Sunday nights, but because the show's quieter qualities, the things it was doing underneath the comedy, were most accessible in the state that nighttime tends to produce. The slightly reduced defenses. The slightly increased permission to feel the weight of things. The specific quality of attention that comes after the day's demands have stepped back, and there is room to actually sit with something rather than process it on the move. The show's comedy was designed for broadcast primetime. Its emotional core was designed for something more private, more interior, the kind of engagement you have with a story when you are alone with it and not performing your response to the people around you. The great Simpsons episodes have always had a component that rewards solitary viewing, something in them that you notice when you are not watching for the communal laugh, when you are watching for what is actually there. This is why the show works as comfort viewing at night, specifically, in a way that more energetic or demanding content does not. The comedy gives you something to engage with actively. The emotional substance gives you something to rest in. The familiar characters and the familiar world provide the specific reassurance of return. And the show's fundamental quality, its insistence that ordinary life contains extraordinary depth, that the unspectacular is worth seeing clearly, that love persists through limitation and failure and remains real, is a quality that lands differently when you are tired, and the day has been hard, and you are sitting with the specific quiet of a house after everyone else has gone. To sleep. Nighttime is when the things you have been carrying all day become visible. The worries that the busyness held at bay. The feelings that did not have room during the hours when there were things to do. The thoughts about the people you love and whether you are doing right by them, and whether the life you are building is the life you actually want to be building. Nighttime is when those thoughts come. And the question is not how to stop them from coming, but what to do with them when they arrive. The Simpsons, at its best, is useful here. Not because it answers the questions, it does not answer the questions, it has never answered the questions, but because it sits with the questions in a specific way. Because it shows you a family that is also carrying things, also navigating the gap between who they are and who they want to be, also loving imperfectly and worrying and trying and failing and trying again. And the showing, done with the care the show brings to it, produces something that feels a little like company. The particular company of recognizing yourself, even partially, even distortedly, even through the lens of a yellow-skinned cartoon family in an impossible town. The company of knowing you are not alone in the specific quality of the difficulty. The show was always making a bet that people at night, watching alone or watching with the quiet kind of attentiveness that comes after the day, would be available to this kind of company. That they would find, underneath the comedy and the familiarity, something genuinely useful. Something that made the nighttime slightly less large and the questions slightly more survivable. That bet has been paying off for 36 years. It paid off tonight, in whatever room you are in whatever hour it happens to be where you are. The fact that you are here, that you stayed, that you let the show and the thinking about the show work on you, this is evidence that the bet was right. What you are watching when you watch The Simpsons at night is a family that did not give up. A family that kept showing up, kept trying, kept returning to each other after every failure and every reset and every impossible situation resolved back to normal. A family that loved each other with everything it had, which was both a great deal and not quite enough, and which is, in that specific combination of abundance and insufficiency, the most honest portrait of love that American television has produced. You are watching evidence that the ordinary life, the modest house and the modest job and the modest town, and the love that does not always find the right words is enough, is more than enough. Is the thing worth having? That is what you are watching when you watch The Simpsons at night. That is what the show was actually about. Rest now. The house on Evergreen Terrace is still there. The family is assembled. The television is on. And somewhere in the background, almost below hearing, the secondary theme is playing. Warm and quiet and entirely itself. Just like Springfield. Just like the family. Just like you. Extended Section 17. Springfield and the American Dream. There is a version of the American Dream that The Simpsons depicts with unwavering consistency across its run, and it is not the version the phrase usually invokes. The version the phrase usually invokes is aspirational, the dream of the immigrant who arrives with nothing and builds everything, the rags to riches story, the promise that hard work and determination will produce material success. That version of the American dream is occasionally visible in Springfield, mostly as the context against which other things are measured, but it is not the version the show is primarily interested in. The version the show is interested in is smaller and more specific and, in many ways, more honestly American. It is the dream of the working man who wants a house and a job and a family and enough money to eat well and watch television and take the occasional vacation and drink beer on weekends without worrying about the bills. It is the dream of modest security, of the life that does not require greatness but provides enough. It is the dream that, for a specific historical period in American life, roughly the mid-century to the early neoliberal era, was actually attainable for a significant proportion of the population through union wages and manufacturing jobs and affordable housing, and the specific economic arrangements that post-war America constructed. Homer's dream is this dream. Not a mansion, not a yacht, not Burns's empire or anyone else's empire. A house on Evergreen Terrace. A car that runs most of the time, food in the refrigerator, the television on in the evening, the family assembled, the weekend stretching ahead with its modest pleasures. This is what Homer wants and, in the most essential sense, what Homer has. The show presents this not as a failure of ambition, but as a specific, legitimate, genuinely satisfying form of life. What it also presents, with characteristic honesty, is the degree to which even this modest dream is under strain. The plant's conditions. The economic precarity that is always just below the surface of Homer's comfortable-seeming life. The way that the maintenance of the house and the car and the food and the television requires continuous negotiation with a system that is not particularly invested in Homer's well-being. The way that the modest dream is always one catastrophe away from being unmanageable. Springfield as a community is the portrait of what happens to the modest American dream when the economic conditions that made it possible erode while the cultural expectation that it is still attainable persists. The gap between the expectation and the reality produces a specific kind of anxiety that is not quite poverty anxiety and not quite middle class in decline anxiety, but something specific to the working class of a deindustrializing economy. Something like the anxiety of the person who is told they should be able to do something and cannot quite do it, and who processes this discrepancy as a personal failure rather than as a structural condition. The show threads this anxiety through Homer's character with consistent care. Homer's relationship to money, to his job, to the economic circumstances of his life is never entirely comfortable. He is not poor in the dramatic sense that television tends to depict poverty. He is not middle-class comfortable in the way that other family sitcoms depicted the middle class. He is somewhere in between, in the specific zone that the show was the first American sitcom to really inhabit, not struggling, not comfortable, managing, in the ongoing, low-level, habitual way of people who have made peace with not quite having enough by finding meaning in what they do have. The American dream in Springfield is the dream that shows up every Sunday night on time, sits down on the couch, and watches whatever is on. The dream of the permanent present, of the family assembled, of the day ended and the evening begun, and the specific modest pleasure of being home. The dream that does not require extraordinary achievement to be real. The dream that is, in its specific ordinariness, something more valuable than the aspirational version, because it is actually available, actually achievable, actually providing the warmth and connection and daily meaning that the larger aspirations tend to promise, but rarely deliver. The show has been celebrating this dream for 36 years. Not uncritically, the critique of the conditions that make the dream harder to achieve is present throughout. But the dream itself, the specific, modest, entirely real dream of a life organized around family and daily pleasure and the warmth of people who know you and love you regardless, the show has always honored, always presented as sufficient, always treated as worth protecting, worth depicting, worth taking seriously as the organizing principle of an entire life and an entire show. Homer has the dream. He knows he has the dream. And on the best days, in the best episodes, in the quietest moments between the comedy and the chaos, he knows that the dream is enough, that the house is enough, that the family is enough, that he is, in the most important sense, a man who has what he was looking for. That is the American dream the show was always about. Not the dream of becoming Burns, the dream of remaining Homer, of keeping the house and the family and the modest pleasures and the specific warmth of Evergreen Terrace against whatever the world sends, of surviving by love rather than by ambition, of being, finally and completely, exactly where you are. Extended Section 18, on endings and the loop. Every ending The Simpsons has ever depicted is provisional. This is built into the show's structure. The episode resolves, the music plays, the credits roll, and then the next week everything is back at the beginning. No consequence has survived the reset. No transformation has taken hold. The lessons that seem to be learned have been unlearned. The crises that seem to be resolved have been restored to their pre-crisis states. Springfield is exactly as it was. The loop has closed and opened again. Most viewers process this as the episodic convention, the structural necessity of a show that cannot age its characters or permanently change its world. And that processing is correct, as far as it goes. The reset is a structural feature, not a narrative choice with particular meaning. But the show has also, over its long history, made the reset into something more than a structural feature. It has made it thematic. It has incorporated the reset into the emotional texture of the show in ways that give it meaning beyond production necessity. The reset is not just the show's form. It is the show's argument. Its argument that the loop is not a prison, or rather, that it is, but that the prison is also something else, also a home, also the specific, reliable, unchanging context within which the particular life of this particular family happens. Also, finally, enough. The loop as home is the show's most comforting idea, the idea that return is always possible. That whatever has happened in the episode, whatever disaster has been produced, whatever damage has been done, whatever impossible situation has been navigated, you can come back next week, and the family will be there. Assembled, intact, ready to begin again. The reset is not forgetting. It is renewal. It is the show's weekly demonstration that these people, this family, this specific love, persists. Homer comes home every episode. He survives every catastrophe and returns to the house, and the family is there, and the loop closes and opens again. This is the show's covenant with its audience. This is what it has been offering for 36 years. Not resolution, not transformation, not the dramatic arc that builds toward a definitive conclusion. The loop, the return, the consistency of a love that survives by being always available to survive. The loop will end, the show will end. The specific form of this covenant will eventually close permanently rather than provisionally. And when it does, what will remain is what has always been there underneath the loop, the episodes, the characters, the accumulated portrait of this family and this town, the specific quality of attention and care and craft that the show brought to the ordinary American life it chose to depict. The ending, when it comes, will be the only reset that does not open again. The loop will close and stay closed, and the family will be frozen, permanently, at whatever moment the last episode depicts Homer on the couch, Marge in the kitchen, Bart in the backyard, Lisa with her saxophone, Maggie with her pacifier. Exactly as they have always been. Exactly as they will always be. Frozen in the amber of the last frame, this is not sad, exactly. Or rather, it is sad in the specific way that all endings are sad, the sadness of acknowledging that the thing you have been able to return to will no longer accept returns. But it is also right. The ending will confirm what the loop has been demonstrating for 36 years, that the family was real, that the love was real, that the specific quality of Springfield as a place and as a home was real, and that real things, when they end, leave something behind, an absence with a specific shape, a silence with a specific quality, the shape and the quality of the thing that was there. Until then, the loop continues. The house is still there. The family is assembled. The television flickers blue through the front window, and outside, barely visible through the glass, the cooling towers on the horizon, and the specific, impossible, beloved sky of Springfield, that particular shade of cartoon blue that belongs to no real place and to every place you have ever called home. Come back whenever you need to. The loop is open. Springfield is waiting. It always will be. Extended Section 19. The specific weight of Sunday night. Sunday night has a particular quality. If you have ever experienced it, and if you grew up watching television in America, you almost certainly have what it is without needing it described. It is the quality of the day that sits between the week that was and the week that is coming. It contains the residue of the weekend's freedom and the approaching weight of Monday's obligation. The light changes in a specific way on Sunday evenings, particularly in autumn, and the change communicates something about time and about the life organized around the week's rhythm that is almost impossible to fully articulate but immediately recognizable. The Simpsons was always a Sunday night show. This was not incidental. Sunday nights at 8 o'clock on Fox became, through the show's dominance of that time slot across the golden era, a kind of cultural appointment. You watched The Simpsons on Sunday nights the way you watched other things that defined specific moments of the week, with a combination of habit and genuine anticipation, with the awareness that the experience was shared with a significant portion of the country simultaneously. The show was a communal event in the broadcast era in a way that streaming has made essentially impossible to reproduce. But the Sunday night quality added something to the experience that the communal aspect alone does not explain. Sunday night is when you are both present in the current week and already aware of the week to come. It is the hour of transitional feeling, of sitting in between, of the specific kind of reflection that the threshold position produces. And The Simpsons, arriving reliably at 8 o'clock into this specific quality of awareness, was received by an audience that was already in the kind of open, reflective state that the show's better material required. The comedy landed harder on Sunday nights. The emotional moments landed harder. The specific observation about family and work and the ordinary difficulty of American life landed harder because the audience was there, in that specific Sunday night state, already thinking about the week and the family and the life, already slightly more available to feeling the weight of things than they would be on a Tuesday at 9. The show and its time slot were calibrated for each other in ways that contributed to the experience being what it was. The Sunday night appointment ended for most viewers as streaming changed the relationship between audiences and broadcast schedules. You watch The Simpsons now when you want to, not when the network tells you to, and this is in almost all respects an improvement. But something was lost in the decoupling of the show from its specific time. Something about the shared simultaneity of the experience. Something about the Sunday night quality that enhanced the show's particular kind of impact. What remains is the show itself, available whenever you want it, receivable in whatever state you happen to be in when you sit down with it. And for many people who watch it late at night, alone, in the specific quiet that the late hours produce, something of the Sunday night quality returns. The transitional feeling, the openness, the availability to the show's quieter registers, the state in which the thing that is underneath the comedy becomes accessible. This is what you have tonight, in whatever form tonight takes for you. The show waiting for you. Springfield exactly as it always has been. The specific quality of attention that the hour and the quiet are providing. And the family on Evergreen Terrace, in the house with the faded yellow paint, entirely themselves and entirely available, doing the thing they have always done, loving each other, failing each other, returning to each other endlessly, in the loop that does not close. That is Sunday night. That is Springfield. That is what the show at the bottom of everything was always actually about. Rest now. You have earned it. The house is still there. The family is home. So are you.